Gaz said. We might get into trouble. I liked being useful. Reminded me of back when I first joined up. You tell her, Vale. Tell her to give us something to do other than gambling and drinking. Because to be honest, I ain't very good at either one. Vale nodded slowly. A washwoman idled by, messing with a sack of laundry. Vale tapped her finger on it. Then she stood and seized the washwoman by the dress and hauled her backward. The woman shouted, dropping her pile of clothing as she stumbled, nearly falling. Vale shoved her hand into the woman's hair, pushing away the wig of mottled brown and black. Underneath the woman's hair was pure leathery black, and she wore ashes on her cheeks, as if she'd been doing hard labor. You, Vale said. This was the woman from the tavern at All's Alley. What had her name been? Ishna? Several nearby soldiers had leapt up with alarmed expressions at the woman's outcry. Every one of those is a soldier from Dalinar's army, Vale noted, suppressing a woman with her eyes. Kholin troops did have a habit of assuming that nobody could take care of themselves. Sit, Vale said, pointing at the table. Red hastily pulled up another chair. Ishna settled herself, holding the wig to her chest. She blushed deeply, but maintained some measure of poise, meeting the eyes of Vapa and his men. You are getting to be an annoyance, woman, Vale said, sitting. Why do you assume I'm here because of you? Ishna said. You're jumping to conclusions. You showed an unhealthy fascination with my associates. Now I find you in disguise, eavesdropping on my conversation. Ishna raised her chin. Maybe I'm just trying to prove myself to you. With the disguise I saw through the moment I glanced at you. You didn't catch me last time, Ishna said. Last time? You talked about where to get Horneater lager, Ishna said. Red insisted it was nasty. Gaz loves it. Storms. How long have you been spying on me? Not long, Ishna said quickly, in direct contradiction to what she just said. But I can assure you, promise it, that I'll be more valuable to you than these rancid buffoons. Please at least let me try. Buffoons, Gaz said. Rancid, Sharp said. Oh, that's just my fool's piss. Walk with me, Vale said, standing up. She strode away from the table. Ishna scrambled to her feet and followed. I wasn't really trying to spy on you, but how else was I quiet? Vale said. She stopped at the doorway to the barracks, far enough from her men that they couldn't hear. She folded her arms, leaning against the wall by the door and looking back at them. Shalom had trouble with follow-through. She had good intentions and grand plans, but she got diverted too easily by new problems, new adventures. Fortunately, Vale could pick up a few of those loose threads. These men had proven that they were loyal, and they wanted to be useful. A woman could be given much less than that to work with. The disguise was well done, she said to Ishna. Next time, rough up your free hand some more. The fingers gave you away. They aren't the fingers of a laborer. Ishna blushed, rolling her free hand into a fist. Tell me what you can do and why I should care, Vale said. You have 2 minutes. Ishna took a deep breath. I was trained as a spy for House Hammurabi. In Vama's court, I know information gathering, message coding, observation techniques, and how to search a room without revealing what I've done. So, if you're so useful, what happened? Your people happened. The Ghost Bloods. I'd heard of them. Whispered of by Bright Lady Hammurabi. She crossed them somehow, and then she shrugged. She ended up dead, and everyone thought it might have been one of us who did it. I fled and ended up in the underground, working for a petty gang of thieves. But I could be so much more. Let me prove it to you. Vale crossed her arms. A spy? That could be useful. Truth was, Vale herself didn't have much actual training. Only what Tin had showed her and what she'd learned on her own. If she was going to dance with the Ghost Bloods, she'd need to be better. Right now, she didn't even know what it was she didn't know. Could she get some of that from Ishna? Somehow get some training without revealing that Vale wasn't as skilled as she pretended to be? An idea began to take form. She didn't trust this woman, but then she didn't need to. And if her former bright lady really had been killed by the Ghost Bloods, perhaps there was a secret to learn there. I have some important infiltrations planned, Vale said. Missions where I need to gather information of a sensitive nature. I can help, Ishna said. What I really need is a support team so I don't have to go in alone. I can find people for you, experts. I wouldn't be able to trust them, Vale said, shaking her head. I need someone I know is loyal. Who? Vale pointed at Vatha and his men. Ishna's expression fell. You want to turn those men into spies? That, and I want you to prove to me what you can do by showing it to those men. And hopefully I can pick up something too. Don't look so daunted. They don't need to be true spies. They just need to know enough about my work to support me and keep watch. Ishna raised her eyebrows skeptically, watching the men. Shaw was obligingly picking his nose. That's a little like saying you want me to teach hogs to talk, with promises it will be easy as they only need to speak Alethi, not Vaden or Herdazian. This is the chance I'm offering Ishna. Take it, or agree to stay away from me. Ishna sighed. All right, we'll see. Just don't blame me if the pigs don't end up talking.
41. On the ground, looking up. Regardless, this is not your concern. You turned your back on divinity. If race becomes an issue, he will be dealt with. And so will you. Teft woke up. Unfortunately, his first sensation was pain. Old, familiar pain. The throbbing behind his eyes, the raw biting needles of his burned fingers, the stiffness of a body that had outlived its usefulness. Kalek's breath. Had he ever been useful? He rolled over, groaning. No coat. Only a tight undershirt, soiled from lying on the ground. He was in an alleyway between tents in the breakaway market. The high ceiling vanished into the darkness. From just beyond the alleyway came the bright sounds of people chatting and haggling. Teft stumbled to his feet and was halfway through relieving himself against some empty boxes before he realized what he was doing. There were no high storms in here to wash the place out. Besides, he wasn't some drunkard who wallowed in filth and pissed in alleys, was he? That thought immediately reminded him of the deeper pain. The pain beyond the pounding in his head or the ache of his bones. The pain that was with him always, like a persistent ringing cutting deep to his core. This pain had awakened him. The pain of need. No, he wasn't just some drunkard. He was far, far worse. He stumbled out of the alleyway trying to smooth his hair and beard. Women he passed held safe hands to mouths and noses, looking away as if embarrassed for him. Perhaps it was a good thing he lost his coat. Storms helped him if anyone recognized who he was. Each came the entire crew. You're already ashamed of the crew, Teft, and you know it, he thought. You're a godless waste of spit. He eventually found his way to the well, where he slouched in a line behind some others. Once at the water, he fell down on his knees, then used a trembling hand to fish out a drink with his tin cup. Once he tasted the cool water, his stomach immediately cramped, rejecting it even though he was parched. This always happened after a night on the moss, so he knew to ride the nausea and the cramps, hoping he could keep the water down. He slumped, holding his stomach, frightening the people in line behind him. Out in a crowd, there was always at least a small crowd near the well. Some men in uniforms shoved through. Forest Green, Sadius's men. No other lines. buckles. And Colin protected Sadius. The soldiers got right up in his face. The Colin soldier finally backed down. Good lad. They didn't need another struggle between Sadius's men and the other soldiers. Taft dipped his cup again, the pain from his previous sip fading. This well seemed deep, rippling water on top and a deep blackness below. He almost threw himself in. If he woke up for examination tomorrow, would he still feel that itching need inside? That would be a bit of torment. Voidbringers wouldn't even have to play his soul. All they'd need to do was tell him he'd never feel sated again. And then they could watch him squirm. Reflected in the waters of the well, a face appeared over his shoulder. Pale white skin, glowing faintly, and hair wrapped by clouds. He said, slapping his hand into the water. You just go find someone who cares. He stumbled back to his feet, finally getting out of the way so someone else could take his spot. Still knows what power wasn't. Those weapons were ready to draw. The drunken military crowds been replaced by the enterprising and industrious. He'd been out all night again. Collect. Returning to the barracks would be the smart thing to do. But could he face them like this? He wandered through the market instead, eyes down. I'm getting worse, a piece of him realized. The first month in Delamar's employ, he'd been able to resist for a while. But he'd had money again after so long as a bridge man. Having money was dangerous. He'd functioned, only mossing an evening here or an evening there. But then Kaladin had left, and this tower, where everything had felt so wrong. Those monsters of darkness, including one that looked just like Taft. He needed the moss to deal with that. It wouldn't. He sighed. When he looked up, he felt that spread standing in front of him. Taft, she whispered. You've spoken oaths. Foolish, stupid oaths, spoken when he'd hoped that being radiant would remove the cravings. He turned away from her and found his way to a tent nestled among the taverns. Those were closed for the morning, but this place, it had no name and didn't need one, was open. It was always open, just like the ones back at Dalamar's war camp had been, just like the ones in Sadius's war camp. They were harder to find in some places than others, but they were always there. Nameless, but still known. A tough-looking Cardassian man sitting at the front waved him in. It was dim inside, but Taft found his way to a table and slumped down. A woman in tight clothing and a glove with no fingers was a bowl of fire. They didn't ask for payment. They all knew there were years on him today. Not but they would be paid eventually. Himself, and at the center, it was slowly multiplied tenfold. He let out a whimper of groan, then seized the fire moss and ground it between his thumb and forefinger. The moss let off a small plume of smoke, and in the dim light, the center of the moss glowed like an ember. It hurt, of course. He'd worn through his calluses last night, and now rubbed the moss with raw, blistering fingers. But this was a sharp, present pain, a good kind of pain. Merely physical, it was a sign of life. It took a minute before he felt the effects. A washing away of his pain was followed by a strengthening of his resolve. He could remember long ago that the fire moss had done more to him. He remembered euphoria, nights spent in a dizzy, wonderful days, where everything around him seemed to make sense. These days, he needed the moss to feel normal. Like a man scrambling up wet rocks, he could barely reach where everyone else was standing before he slowly started sliding back down. It wasn't euphoria he craved anymore. It was the mere capacity to keep on going. The moss washed away his burdens, memories of that dark version of himself, memories of turning his family in as heretics, even though they'd been right all along. He was a wretch and a coward and didn't deserve to wear the symbol of Bridge 4. He'd as good as betrayed that spread already. She best have fled. To pick him down about the fire moss. Unfortunately, there was something broken in Teft. Long ago, he'd gone to the moss at the urgings of other men in his squad and Sadius' army. They could rub the stuff and get some benefit, like a man chewed Bridge bark when on guard duty to stay awake. A little fire moss, a little relaxation, and then they moved on with their lives. Teft didn't work that way. Burdens shoved aside, he could have gotten up and gone back to the Bridgeman. He could have started his day. But Storms, a few more minutes sounded so nice. He kept going. He went through 3 bowls before a garish light made him blink. He pulled his face off the table where, to his shame, he drooled a puddle. How long had it been? And what was that terrible, awful light? Here he is, Catherine's voice said as Teft blinked. A figure knelt beside the table. Oh, Teft. He owes us but 3 bowls, said the den's keeper. 1 large room. Deep blood, an accented voice growled. We do not rip off pieces of your body and pay you with those. Storms. Rock was here too? Teft groaned, turning away. Don't see me, he croaked. Don't. Our establishment is perfectly legal, Juanita, the den keeper said. If you assault us, be assured we will bring the guard, and they will defend us. Not money, you eel, Kaladin said, pushing the light toward them. Rock, can you get him? Bart he was crying. The leg. Where's your coat, Teft? Kaladin asked from the darkness. I was so Teft admitted, squeezing his eyes shut against the shameless spread that drifted down around him in the shape of flower petals. I sold my own storming coat. Kaladin fell silent. Teft let him carry him. Halfway back, he finally managed to scrunch up enough dignity to make them let him walk with a little support. Teft envied better men than he. They didn't have the itch. It went so deep that it stung his soul. It was persistent. He was with him and couldn't ever be scratched, despite how hard he tried. Kaladin and Rock set him up in one of the barrack rooms, private, wrapped in blankets and with a bowl of Roxas tea in his hands. Teft made the proper noises, the ones they expected. Apologies, promises he would tell them that he was feeling the need again, promises that he'd let them help him, though he couldn't eat the stew, not yet. It would be another day before he could keep anything down. Storms, but they were good men, better friends than he deserved. They were all growing into something grand, while Teft just stayed on the ground looking up. They left him to get some rest. He stared at the stew with a familiar scent not daring to escape. He'd go back to work before the day was out, training bridgemen on the other crews. He could function. He could go for days pretending that he was normal. Storms, he'd balanced everything in Sadius' army for years before taking one step too far, missing duty 1 too many times and landing himself in the bridge crews as punishment. Those months running bridges had been the only time in his adult life when he hadn't been dominated by the boss. But even back then, when he'd been able to afford a little alcohol, he'd known that eventually he'd find his way. The liquor wasn't ever enough. Even as he braced himself to go to work for the day, one nagging thought overshadowed his mind. A shameful thought. I'm not going to get any more moss for a while. Knowledge hurt him more than anything. He was going to have to go a few excruciating days feeling like half a man. Days when he couldn't feel anything but his own self-loathing. Days living with the shame, the memories, the glances of other bridgemen. Days without any storming help whatsoever. That terrified him. 42. Consequences. Savandrius, bearer of the first gem, you must know better than to approach us by relying upon presumption of past relationship. Inside the increasingly familiar vision, Dalinar carefully nodded the arrow. Fletched missile. The man's screech was lost in the above. Ahead, men fought frantically as the warriors ran toward the edge of a cliff. Dalinar methodically knocked a second arrow, then loosed. The man dropped his axe mid-swing, causing him to miss the young, dark-skinned youth lying on the ground. The boy was barely into his teens. The awkwardness hadn't left him yet, and he had limbs that seemed too long, a face that was too round, too childlike. Dalinar might have let him run messages, but not hold a spear. The lad's age hadn't prevented him from being named Prime Pakasix Yanagam I, ruler of Azir, Emperor of Greater Makabak. Dalinar had perched on some rocks, bow in hand. While he didn't intend to repeat his mistake of letting Queen Ben manage all on her own in a vision, he also didn't want to give up his challenge or service. There was a reason the Almighty his visions. He needed a visual understanding of what was at stake. He felt another enemy very close to the boy. The shots weren't difficult from his vantage near the fight. He had some training with the bow, though his archery in recent years had been with so-called shard bows, fabrial bows crafted with such a heavy draw weight that it was strange experiencing this battle for the third time. Though each repetition played out slightly differently, there were certain familiar details. The sense of smoke and moldy inhuman blood. The way that man below was screaming the same half-prayer, half-condemnation. With Dalinar's bowmanship, the band of defenders lasted against the enemy until the rain landed over the edge of the cliff, blowing in sharp plate. Emperor Yanagam sat down as the other soldiers rallied around the Radiant and pushed the enemy backward. Dalinar lowered his bow, reading the terror in the central figure. Other men spoke of getting the shakes when the fight was over, the horror of it catching up with them. The Emperor finally stumbled to his feet, using the spear like a stab. He didn't notice Dalinar, didn't even question why some of the bodies around him had arrows. This boy was no soldier, though Dalinar hadn't expected him to be one. From his experience, Azir's generals were too pragmatic to want the throne. It involved too much pandering to bureaucrats and apparently dictating essays. The youth started down the path away from the cliff, and Dalinar followed. Aharietiam. The people who lived through this had thought the end of the world. Surely they assumed they'd soon return to the Tranquiline halls. How would they respond to the information that, after war, the boy stopped at the bottom of the twisting path which led into the valley between rock formations. He watched wounded men limp by, supported by friends. Yells and shouts rose in the air. Dalinar intended to step up and start explaining about these visions, but the boy strode out to walk beside some wounded men, chatting with them. Dalinar followed, curious, catching fragments of conversation. What happened here? Who are you? Why were you fighting? The men didn't have many answers. They were wounded, exhausted, trailed by pain spread. They did find their way to a larger group, though, in the direction Yasna had gone during Dalinar's previous visit to this vision. The crowd had gathered around a man standing on a large boulder. Tall and confident, the man was in his 30s and he wore white and blue. He had the Alethi philotelic 17, not white. His skin was a shade darker and something was making off about his features. Yet there was something familiar about the man. You must spread the word, the man proclaimed. We have won. At long last, the Voidbringers are defeated. This is not my victory, or that of the other heralds. It is your victory. You have done this. Some of the people shouted in triumph. Too many others stood silent, staring with dead eyes. I will lead the charge for the Tranquiline Halls, the man shouted. You will not see me again, but think not on that now. You have won your peace. Revel in it. Rebuild. Go now. Help your fellows. Carry with you the light of your herald king's words. We are victorious at long last over evil. Another round of shouts, more energetic this time. Storms, Eleanor thought, feeling a chill. This was Ysariza Uthin himself, herald of kings, the greatest among them. Wait, did the king have dark eyes? The group broke up, but the emperor remained, staring at the face of the herald instant. Finally he whispered, Ysir, king of the heralds. Yes, Delmar said, stepping up beside him. That was him, Your Excellency. My niece visited this vision earlier, and she wrote that she thought she'd spotted him. Yanagon grabbed Delmar on the arm. What did you say? You know me? You are Yanagon of Aesir, Dalinar said. He nodded his head in a semblance of a bow. I am Dalinar Gulin, and I apologize that our meeting must take place under such irregular circumstances. The youth's eyes widened. I see Ysir himself first, and now my enemy. I am not your enemy, Dalinar sighed. And this is no mere dream, Your Excellency. I know it's not a dream, Dalinar said. I am a prince raised in the regulars. The heralds may choose to speak through me. He looked around. This day we are living through. Dalinar said. Yes. Why did they place you here? What does it mean? They didn't place me here, Dalinar said. Your Excellency, I instigated this vision, and I brought you into it. Skeptical, the boy folded his arms. He wore the leather skirt provided by the vision. He left his bronze-tipped spear leaning against a rock nearby. Have you been told, Dalinar asked, that I am considered mad? There are rumors. Well, this was my madness, Dalinar said. I suffered visions during the storms. Come. You have gone to a better view of the large field which is spread out in the mouth of the canyon. Yanagon followed, then his face grew passionate at the sight. Finally, he strode down onto the larger valley, moving among the corpses, and nurses. Dalinar walked beside him. So many dead eyes, so many faces twisted in pain, light-eyed and dark. Pale skin like the Shin and some more eaters. Dark skin like the Makabaki. Many could have been Lethe, Aiden, or Adassian. There were other figures, of course. The giant broken stone figures, partially wearing northborn with chitin armor and orange blood. One spot they passed had a whole heap of strange crumblings, burned and smoky. Who would have taken the time to pile up 1,000 little crustaceans? Yanagon said. Reluctantly persistent, said. To fight the desolation of God and madness. Yanagon eyed him. You wanted to talk to me without the viziers. You wanted me alone. And you just show me whatever will strengthen your argument. If you accept that I have the power to show you these visions, Dalinar said, would that not in itself imply that you should listen to me? Your Lethe are dangerous. Do you know what happened the last time? Is here? The Sunmaker's rule was a long time ago. The viziers have talked about this, Yanagon said. They told me all about it. It started the same way back then, with a warlord uniting the Alethi tribes. Tribes? Dalinar said. You compare us to the nomads that roam Tudela? Alethkar is one of the most cultured peoples on Roshar. Your code of law is barely 30 years old. Your Excellency, Dalinar said, taking a deep breath. I doubt this line of conversation will be relevant. Look around us. Look and see what the desolation will bring. He swept his hand across the awful view, and Yanagon's temper cooled. It was impossible.
Ooh. Sorry, I forget about you. I'm really sorry about that. I don't even know if you can hear me.
Anything but sorrow when confronted by so much death. Eventually, Yanagon turned and started back the way they'd come. Dalinar joined them, hands clasped behind. They say, Yanagon whispered, that when the Sunmaker rode out of the passes and into Asia, he had one unexpected problem. He conquered my people too quickly and didn't know what to do with all of his captives. He couldn't leave a fighting population behind him in the towns. There were thousands upon thousands of men he needed to murder. Sometimes he'd simply assign the work to his soldiers. Every man was to kill 30 captives, like a child who had to find their own load of firewood before being allowed to play. In other places, the Sunmaker declared something arbitrary. Say that every man with hair beyond a certain length was to be slaughtered. Before he was struck down with disease by the Terrans, he murdered 10% of the population of Asia. They say Zofix was filled with the bones, blown by ice storms into piles as tall as the buildings. I am not my ancestor, Dalinar said softly. You revere him. They let it all but worship, Sadies. You carry his storming shark blade. I gave that away. They stopped at the edge of the battlefield. The Emperor had grit, but didn't know how to carry himself. He walked with shoulders slumped, and his hands kept reaching for pockets his antiquated clothing didn't have. He was a low bird, though in Aesir they didn't properly revere eye color. Navani had once told him it was because there weren't enough people in Aesir with bright eyes. The Sunmaker himself had used this to justify conquering them. I am not my ancestor, Dalinar repeated. I do share much with him. A youth of brutality, a lifetime spent at war. I have one advantage he did not, which is, Dalinar met the young man's eyes. I've lived long enough to see the consequences of what I've done. Dalinar nodded slowly. Yeah, a voice piped up. You're old. Dalinar turned, frowning. But it sounded like a young girl. Why would there be a girl on the battlefield? I didn't expect you to be so old, the girl said. She sat perched cross-legged on a large boulder nearby. And you're not really that black. They called you Blackthorn, but you're really more like dark tan thorn. Gox is more black than you are, and even he's pretty brownish. The young Emperor rapidly burst into an enormous grin. Lift! You're back! He started climbing up the boulder, heedless of decorum. Not quite back, she said. Got sidetracked. But I'm close now. What happened in Yedal? Yanagon said, eager. You barely gave me any kind of explanation. Those people lie about their food. She narrowed her eyes at Dalinar as the young Emperor slipped down the boulder, then tried to climb up another side. This is not possible, the Stormfather said in Dalinar's mind. How did she come here? You didn't bring her in, Dalinar said softly. No, this is not possible. How? Yanagon finally attained the top of the boulder and gave the younger girl a hug. She had long dark hair, pale white eyes, and tan skin, though she likely wasn't a Letty. The face was too round. Ready, perhaps? He's trying to convince me I should trust him, Yanagon said, pointing at Dalinar. Don't, she said. He's got too nice a butt. Dalinar cleared his throat. What? Your butt is too nice. Old guys shouldn't have tight butts. It means you spend way too much time swinging a sword or punching people. You should have an old, flabby butt. Then I'd trust you. She has a thing about butts, Yonaghan said. No, I don't, the girl said, rolling her eyes. If someone thinks I'm strange for talking about butts, it's usually because they're jealous. Because I'm the only one without something rammed up mine. She narrowed her eyes at Delanar, then took the Emperor by the arm. Let's go. But, Delanar said, raising his hand. See? You're learning. She greeted him. Then she and the Emperor vanished. The Stormfather rumbled in frustration. That woman. This is a creation specifically meant to defy my will. Woman? Delanar asked, shaking his head. That child is tainted by the Night Watcher. Technically, so am I. This is different. This is unnatural. She goes too far. The Stormfather rumbled his discontent, refusing to speak to Delanar further. He seemed genuinely upset. In fact, Delanar was forced to sit and wait until the vision finished. He spent the time staring out over that field of the dead, haunted equally by the future and the past. 43. Spirit. You have spoken to one who cannot respond. We instead will take your communication to us, though we know not how you located us upon this world. Moash picked at the mush that Febrith called a stew. It tasted like crab. He stared at the flame spread in their large cook fire, trying to warm himself as Febrith, a Thaylen man with striking hornier red hair, argued with Graves. The fire's smoke curled into the air, and the light would be visible for miles across the frost mats. Graves didn't care. He figured that if the Everstorm had cleared the bandits out of the area, 2 sharp arrows would be more than enough to deal with any who remained. Sharp blades can't stop the arrow in the back, Moash thought, feeling exposed. And not even light, if we're not wearing it. His armor and that of Graves lay bundled in their wagon. Look, that is the Triplets, Graves said, waving toward a rock formation. It's right here on the map. We go west now. I've been this way before, Everett said. You must continue south, you see. Then east. The map. I had no need for your maps, Everett said, folding his arms. The passions guide me. The passions? Graves said, throwing his hands up. The passions? You're supposed to have abandoned such superstitions. You belong to the diagram now. I can do both, Everett said solemnly. Moash stuffed another spoonful of stew into his mouth. Storms, he hated it when Everett took a turn cooking, and when Graves took a turn, and when Thea took a turn, and, well, as Moash himself cooked, tasted like spiced dishwater. None of them could cope with a dun chip, not like rock. Moash dropped his plate, letting the mush slop over the side. He grabbed his coat off a tree branch and stalked out into the night. The cold air felt strange on his skin after so long in front of the fire. He hated how cold it was down here. Perpetual winter. The 4 of them had suffered through storms, hiding in the cramped, reinforced bottom of their wagon, which they'd chained to the ground. They'd frightened away Rogue partially with their sharp blades. They hadn't been nearly as dangerous as he worried. But that new storm. Moash kicked at a rock, but it was frozen to the ground, and he just stubbed his toe. He cursed, then glanced over his shoulder as the argument ended in shouts. He'd once admired how refined Graves seemed. That had been before spending weeks crossing a barren land together. With expeditions and brave with friends, and his refinement didn't matter much when they were all eating slop and racing behind hills. Somehow lost on Moash asked as Graves strutted in the darkness outside camp. Not lost at all, Graves said. If that idiot would actually look at a map. He glanced at Moash Graves turned at his heel and walked back toward the end. Moash felt the Bridgeport patch on his shoulder. It brought memories. Tony Graves and his band who had been planning to kill King Northgard. An assassination attempt once Dalinar was away, marching toward the center of the shattered flames. His confidence begun, wounded and bleeding. You will not have him. Moash's skin had grown clammy from the cold. He slid his knife from his side sheath. He still wasn't used to being able to carry one that long. The knife that was too big because he was in trouble with dark eyes. He wasn't dark-eyed anymore. He was one of them. Storms, he was one of them. He cut the stitches on the Bridgeport patch, up one side, then down the other. How simple it was. It would be hard to remove the tattoo he got with the others, but then he'd have placed on his shoulder, not his forehead. Moash held up the patch, trying to catch the firelight for a last throw, and then couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He walked back himself by the fire, with the others sitting around rocks and stew pots somewhere, laughing, joking, depending on how many buckets of ale Lopen could drink, ribbing Kaladin and trying to get him to crack a smile. Moash could almost hear their voices, and he smiled, imagining that he was there. Then he imagined Kaladin telling him what Moash had done. He tried to kill me, Kaladin would say. He betrayed everything. His oath to protect the king, his duty to Alethkar, but most importantly, us. Moash sagged, patting his fingers. He should throw the thing in the fire. Storms. He should throw himself in the fire. He looked up toward the skies, toward both damnation and the Tranquiline Halls. A group of stars sprang quickly above. And beside them, something moving in the sky. Moash shouted, throwing himself backward off the perch as 4 Voidbringers descended upon the little camp. They smashed into the ground, wielding long, sinuous swords, not sharp blades, those were Marshet's weapons. One creature struck where Moash had been sitting an instant before. Another creature stabbed Graves straight through the chest, then yanked the weapon free and beheaded him with a backhand swipe. Graves' corpse tumbled, and his sharp blade materialized, clanging to the ground. Liberath and Bia didn't have a chance. Other Voidbringers struck them down, spilling their blood in this cold, forgotten land. The 4th Voidbringer came from Moash and threw himself into a whirl. The creature's sword slammed down near him, hitting a rock, the blade throwing sparks. Moash rose to his feet, and Kaladin's training drilled into him through hours and hours spent at the bottom of a chasm he took over. He danced away, putting his back to the wagon, as his sharp blade fell into his fingers. Voidbringer ran to the fire toward him, light glittering from a taut, muscular body. These weren't like the Mashenti he'd seen on shattered plains. They had deep red eyes and red violet carapace, some of which framed their faces. The one facing them had a swirling line to her skin, 3 different colors mixing: red, black, white. Dark light, like inverse storm light, clung to each of them. Graves had spoken of these creatures, calling their return merely one of the events predicted by the inscrutable diagram. Moash spoke came for him, and he lashed out with his blade, driving her back. She seemed to cry as she moved, feet barely touching the ground. The other 3 ignored him, instead picking through the camp and inspecting the bodies. One sword in a graceful leap off the wagon, and again digging in the air at his hair. His opponent tried again, carefully sweeping her long curved sword at him. Moash shot back, sharp blade ripping through a camp, trying to intercept her weapon. His motions seemed clumsy compared to the graceful power of this creature. She slipped to the side, clothing rippling in the wind, breath visible in the cold air. She wasn't taking chances against a sharp blade and didn't strike as Moash stumbled. Storms, this weapon was just too clunky. 6 feet long, it was hard to angle right. Yes, I could cut through anything, but he needed to actually hit for that to matter. It had been much easier to wield the thing wearing plate. Without it, he felt like a child holding an adult's weapon. The Woodbringer smiled. Then she struck, alluring speed. Moash stepped back and swinged, forcing her to twist to the side. He took a long cut up the arm, but his move prevented him from killing him. His arm flared in pain and he grunted. The boy was running in front, knowing that he was dead. Maybe she simply let it happen. The boy working in the car sensibly eager, excited. He found the shard plate. He kicked other items while digging in free as something rolled out the back of the wagon, thumping against the stone. A spear. Moash looked down at his shard blade. Wealth of nations, the most valuable possession a man could own. Who am I kidding? He thought. Who did I ever think I was kidding? The Voidbringer woman launched into an attack, but Moash dismissed his shard blade and dashed away. His attacker was so surprised that she hesitated, and Moash had time to dive for the spear rolling to his feet. Holding the smooth wood in his hand, a familiar weight, Moash snapped easily into his stance. The air suddenly smelled damp and gently rough. He remembered the chasms. Life and death together, binds and rot. He could almost hear Kaladin's voice. You can't fear a sharp blade. You can't fear light eyes on horseback. They kill with fear first and the sword second. Stand your ground. The Voidbringer came for him and Moash stood his ground. He turned her aside by catching a weapon on the haft of the spear. Then he thrust the butt end of the spear up underneath her arm as she came in for a backhand. The Voidbringer gasped in surprise as Moash executed a takedown he'd practiced 1,000 times in the chasms. He swung the butt of his spear at her ankles and swept her legs out from under her. He began to follow it a classic twist and thrust to stab down through her chest. Unfortunately, the Voidbringer didn't fall. She caught herself in the air, hovering instead of collapsing. Moash noticed in time and pulled out of his maneuver to block her next attack. The Voidbringer glided backward, then dropped to the ground in a prowling crouch, sword held to the side. She then leaped forward and grabbed Moash's spear as he tried to use it to ward her off. Storms. She gracefully pulled herself close to him, inside his reach. She smelled of wet clothing and the alien, moldy scent he associated with the Parshendi. She pressed her hand against Moash's chest, and that dark light transferred from her to him. Moash felt himself grow lighter. Fortunately, Kaladin had tried this on him too. Moash seized the Voidbringer with one hand, holding onto the front of the loose shirt as his body tried to fall into the air. His sudden pull jerked her off balance, even lifted her a few inches. He yanked her up toward him with one hand, while pushing his spearhead down against the rocky ground. That sent the two of them spinning in the air, hovering. She cried out in an alien tongue. Moash dropped his spear and grabbed his knife. She tried to shove him away, lashing him again, stronger this time. He grunted, but hung on and got his knife up and rammed it into her chest. Orange Parshendi blood poured around his hand, spraying into the cold night as they continued to spin in the air. Moash hung on tight and pushed the knife farther. She didn't heal as Kaladin would have. Her eyes stopped glowing, and the dark light vanished. The body grew limp. A short time later, the force pulling Moash upward ran out. He dropped the 5 feet to the ground, her body cushioning his fall. Orange blood coated him, steaming in the chill air. He seized his spear again, fingers slick with blood, and pointed it at the 3 remaining Voidbringers, who regarded him with stunned expressions. Bridge 4, you bastards, Moash growled. 2 of the Voidbringers turned toward the 3rd, the other woman, who looked Moash up and down. You can probably kill me, Moash said, wiping a hand on his clothes to improve his grip. But I'll take one of you with me. At least one. They didn't seem angry that he killed their friend. Storms, though, did things like these even have emotions? Janet often just sat around staring. He locked eyes with the woman at the center. Her skin was white and red, not a bit of black in it. The paleness of that white reminded him of the Shin, who always looked sickly to Moash. You, she said in accented Alethi, have passion. One of the others handed her Graves' sharp blade. She held it up, inspecting it by the firelight. Then she rose into the air. You may choose, she said to him. Die here, or accept defeat and give up your weapons. Noash clung to the spear in the shadow of that figure, her clothing rippling in the air. Did they think he'd actually trust them? But then, did he really think he could stand against 3 of them? With a shrug, he tossed aside the spear. He summoned his blade. After all those years dreaming of one of these, he finally received one. Kaladin had given it to him. And what good had come of it? He obviously couldn't be trusted with such a weapon. Setting his jaw, Noash pressed his hand to the gemstone and willed the bond to break. The gemstone at its pommel flashed, and he felt an icy coolness wash through him. Back to being at dark eyes. He tossed the blade to the ground. One water cleaner saw it. Another flew off, and Noash was confused as to what was happening. A short time later, that one returned with 6 more. 3 attached ropes to the sharp blade bundles, then flew off, hauling the heavy armor into the air after them. Why not flash it? Noash thought for a moment they were actually going to leave him there. But finally, 2 others grabbed him, 1 arm each, and hauled him into the air.
44. The bright side. We are indeed intrigued, for we thought it well hidden, insignificant among our many realms. Vale lounged in a tavern tent with her men. Her boots up on a table, chair tipped back. She listened to the light bubbling around her. People drinking and chatting, others strolling the path outside, shouting and joking. She enjoyed the warm, enveloping buzz of fellow humans who had turned this tomb of rock into something alive again. It still daunted her to contemplate the size of the tower. How had anyone built a place this big? It could gobble up most cities Vale had seen without having to loosen its belt. Well, that's not to think about that. You needed to sneak low beneath all the questions that distracted scribes and scholars. That was the only way to get anything useful done. Instead, she focused on the people. Their voices blended together, and collectively they became a faceless crowd. But the grand thing about people was that you could also choose to focus on particular faces, really see them, and find a wealth of stories. So many people with so many lives, each a separate little mystery. Infinite detail, like pattern. Look close at his fractal lines, and you realize each little ridge had an entire architecture of its own. Look close at a given person, and you'd see their uniqueness. See that they didn't quite match whatever broad category you'd first put them in. So, Red said, talking to Ishna. Vale had brought 3 of her men today with the spy woman to train them. So Vale could listen, learn, and try to judge if this woman was trustworthy, or if she was some kind of plant. This is great, Red continued. But when do we learn the stuff with the knives? Not that I'm eager to kill anyone, just, I know what? Ishna asked. Knives are deviant, Red said. Deviant? Vale asked, opening her eyes. Red nodded. Deviant. Incredible or neat, but in a smooth way. Everyone knows that knives are deviant, Gaz added. Ishna rolled her eyes. The short woman wore her hava with hand covered, and her dress had a light touch of embroidery. Her poise and dress indicated she was a dark-eyed woman of relatively high social standing. Vale drew more attention, and not just because of her white jacket and hat. It was the attention of men assessing whether they wanted to approach her, which they didn't do with Ishna. The way she carried herself, the prim hava, kept them back. Vale sipped her drink, enjoying the wine. You've heard lurid stories, I'm sure, Ishna said. But espionage is not about knives in alleys. I barely know what to do with myself if I had to stab someone. The 3 men deflated. Espionage, Ishna continued, is about the careful gathering of information. Your task is to observe, but not to be observed. You must be likable enough that people talk to you, but not so interesting that they remember you. Well, Gaz is out, Red said. Yeah, Gaz said. It's a curse to be so storming interesting. Would you two shut up? Vava said. The lanky soldier had leaned in, cup of cheap wine left untouched. How? He asked. I'm tall. Gaz has one eye. Will be remembered. You need to learn to channel attention towards superficial traits you can change, and away from traits you cannot. Red, if you wore an eye patch, that detail would stick in their minds. Vava can teach you how to slouch, so your height isn't noticeable. And if you add an unusual accent, people will describe you by that. Gaz, I could put you in a tavern and have you lie on the table in a faint drunken stupor. Nobody will notice the eye patch. They'll ignore you as a drunkard. That is beside the point. We must begin with observation. If you are to be useful, you need to be able to make quick assessments of a location, memorize details, and be able to report back. Now, close your eyes. They reluctantly did so, Vale joining them. Now, Ishna said, can any of you describe the tavern's occupants without looking, mind you? Gaz scratched at his eye patch. There's a cute one at the bar. She might be Phelan. What color is her blouse? Well, it's low cut, and she's grown some nice rock buds. There's this really ugly guy with an eye patch, Red said. Short, annoying type. Drinks your wine when you aren't looking. Vafa? Ishna asked. What about you? I think there were some guys at the bar, he said. They were in Sabarial uniforms, and maybe half the tables were occupied. I couldn't say by who. Better, Ishna said. I didn't expect you to be able to do this. It's human nature to ignore these things. I'll train you, though, so that... Wait, Vava said. What about Vale? What does she remember? 3 men at the bar, Vale said absently. Older man with whitening hair and 2 soldiers, probably related, judging by those hooked noses. The younger one is drinking wine. The older one is trying to pick up the woman Gaz noticed. She's not Phelan, but she's wearing a Phelan dress with a deep violet blouse and a forest green skirt. I don't like the pairing, but she seems to. She's confident, used to playing with the attention of men. But I think she came here looking for someone because she's ignoring the soldier and keeps glancing over her shoulder. The barkeep is an older man, short enough that he stands on boxes when he fills orders. I bet he hasn't been a barkeep long. He hesitates when someone orders and has to glance over the bottles, reading their glyphs and finds the right one. There are 3 barmaids. One is on break. And 14 customers, other than us. She opened her eyes. I can tell you about them. Won't be necessary, Ishna said. Red clapped softly. Very impressive, Vale. Though we should note that there are 15 other customers, not 14. Vale started, then glanced around the tent room again, counting, as she'd done in her head just a moment ago. 3 at that table, 4 over there. 2 women standing together by the door. And the one she'd missed nestled into a chair by a small table at the back of the tent. She wore simple clothing, a skirt and blouse of Alethi peasant design. Had she intentionally chosen clothing that blended in with the white tent and brown table? And what was she doing there? Taking notes, Vale thought with a spike of alarm. The woman had carefully hidden a little notebook in her lap. Who is she? Vale hunkered down. Why is she watching us? Not us specifically, Ishna said. There will be dozens like her in the market, moving like bats, gathering what information they can. She might be independent, selling tidbits she finds, but likely she's employed by one of the high princes. That's the job I used to do. I guess from the people she's watching that she's been told to gather a report on the move of the troops. Vale nodded and listened intently, as Ishna started training the men in memory tricks. She suggested they should learn glyphs and use some ploy, like making marks on their hands, to help them keep track of information. Vale had heard of some of these tricks, including the one Ishna talked about, the so-called Mind Museum. Most interesting were Ishna's tips on how to tell what was relevant to report and how to find it. She talked about listening for the names of high princes and for common words used as stand-ins for more important matters, and about how to listen for someone who had just the right amount of drink in them to say things they shouldn't. Tone, she said, was key. You could sit 5 feet from someone sharing important secrets, but miss it because you were focused on the argument at the next table over. The state she described was almost meditative, sitting and letting your ears take in everything, your mind latching on to only certain conversations. Vale found it fascinating. But after about an hour of training, Gaz complained that his head felt like he'd had 4 bottles already. Red was nodding, and the way his eyes were crossed made him seem completely overwhelmed. Father, though, he'd closed his eyes and was reeling off descriptions of everyone in the room to Ishna. Vale grinned. For as long as she'd known the man, he'd gone about each of his duties as if he had a boulder tied to his back, slow to move, quick to find a place to sit down and rest. Seeing this enthusiasm from him was encouraging. In fact, Vale was so engaged, she completely missed how much time had passed. When she heard the market bells, she cursed softly. Oh, storming fool. Vale? Vava asked. I've got to get going, she said. Shallan has an appointment. Who would have thought that bearing an ancient divine mantle of power and honor would involve so many meetings? And she can't make it without you, Vava said. Storms, have you watched that girl? She'd forget her feet if they weren't stuck on. Keep practicing. I'll meet up with you later. She pulled on her hat and went dashing through the breakaway. A short time later, Shallan Davar, now safely tucked back into a blue hava, strolled through the hallway beneath Urithiru. She was pleased with the work that Vale was doing with the men. Storms, did she have to drink so much? Shallan burned off practically an entire barrel's worth of alcohol to clear her head. She took a deep breath, then stepped into the former library room. Here she found not only Navani, Yasna, and Tesha, but a host of ardents and scribes. May Aladar, Adratagia from Karbran. There were even 3 storm wardens, the odd men with the long beards who liked to predict the weather. Shallan had heard that they would occasionally use the blowing of the wings to foretell the future, but they never offered such services openly. Being near them made Shallan wish for a glyph ward. Vale didn't keep any handy, unfortunately. She was basically a heretic, and thought about religion as often as she did sea silk prices in Ral El-Arim. At least Yasna had the backbone to pick a side and denounce it. Vale would simply shrug and make some wisecrack. It pattern whispered from her skirt. Shallan? Right. She'd been just standing in the doorway, hadn't she? She walked in, unfortunately passing Yanela, who was acting as Tesha's assistant. The pretty young woman stood with her nose perpetually in the air, and was the type of person whose very enunciation made Shallan's skin crawl. The woman's arrogance was what Shallan didn't like. Not, of course, that Adolin had been courting Yanela soon before meeting Shallan. She'd once tried to avoid Adolin's former romantic partners, but, well, that was like trying to avoid soldiers on a battlefield. They were just kind of everywhere. A dozen conversations buzzed through the room. Talk about weights and measures, the proper placement of punctuation, and the atmosphere variations in the tower. Once, she'd have given anything to be in a room like this. Now she was constantly late to the meetings. What had changed? I know how much a fraud I am, she thought. hugging the wall, passing a pretty young Arden discussing Azish politics with one of the storm wardens. Shalon had barely perused those books that Evelyn had brought. On her other side, Navani was talking fabrials with an engineer in a bright red coffin. The woman nodded eagerly. Yes, but how to stabilize it like this? With the sails underneath, it will want to spin over, won't it? Shalon's proximity to Navani had offered ample opportunity to study fabrical science. Why hadn't she? As it enveloped her, the ideas, the questions, the logic, she suddenly felt she was drowning, overwhelmed. Everyone in this room knew so much, and she felt insignificant compared to them. I need someone who can handle this, she thought. A scholar. Part of me can become a scholar. Not fame or brightness radiant, but someone. Pattern started humming on her dress again. Shalon backed to the wall. No, this was her, wasn't it? Shalon had always wanted to be a scholar, hadn't she? She didn't need another persona to deal with this, right? Right? The moment of anxiety passed, and she breathed out, forcing herself to steady. Eventually, she pulled a pad of paper and a charcoal pencil out of her satchel, then sought out Yasna and presented herself. Yasna cocked an eyebrow. Late again. Sorry. I intended to ask your help understanding some of the translations we're receiving from the Dawn Shed, but we haven't time before my mother's meeting starts. Maybe I could help you. I have a few items to finish up. We can speak later. An abrupt dismissal, but nothing more than Shalon had come to expect. She walked over to a chair beside the wall and sat down. Surely, she said softly, if Yasna had known that I'd just confronted a deep insecurity of mine, she'd have shown some empathy, right? Yasna, Pattern asked. I do not think you are paying attention, Shalon. She is not very empathetic. Shalon sighed. You're empathetic, though. The pathetic part, at least. She steeled herself. I belong here, Pattern, don't I? Yes, of course you do. You'll want to get there, right? The classic scholars didn't just draw. The oil sworn knew mathematics. He created the study of ratios in art. Khalid was an inventor, and her designs are still used in astronomy today. Sailors couldn't find longitude at sea until the arrival of her clock. Yasna's a historian, and more. That's what I want. Are you sure? I think so. Problem was, Vale wanted to spend her days drinking and laughing with the men practicing espionage. Radiant wanted to practice with the sword and spend time around Caitlin. What did Shalon want? Did it matter? Eventually, Navani called the meeting to order and people took seats. Scribes on one side of Navani, Ardents from a variety of devotaries on the other, and far from Yasna. As the storm wardens settled down farther around the ring of seas, Shalon noticed Renarin standing in the doorway. He shuffled, peeking in, but not entering. When several scholars turned toward him, he stepped backward, as if their stares were physically forcing him out. Renarin said. Father said I could come. Just listen, maybe. You're more than welcome, cousin, Yasna said. She nodded for Shalon to get him a stool, so she did, and didn't even protest being ordered about. She could be a scholar. She'd be the best little ward ever. Head down, Renarin rounded the ring of scholars, keeping a white-knuckled grip on a chain hung from his pocket. As soon as he sat, he started pulling the chain between the fingers of one hand, then the other. Shalon did her best to take notes, and not stray into sketching people instead. Fortunately, the proceedings were more interesting than usual. Navani had most of the scholars here working on trying to understand human theory. Inadara reported first. She was a whizzing scribe who reminded Shalon of her father's Ardents, explaining that her team had been trying to ascertain the meaning of the strange shapes of the rooms and tunnels in the tower. She went on at length, talking of defensive constructions, air filtration, and the wells. She pointed out groupings of rooms that were shaped oddly, and of the bizarre murals they'd found, depicting fanciful creatures. When she eventually finished, Calamy reported on her team, who were convinced that certain gold and copper metalworks they found embedded in walls were fabrials, but they didn't seem to do anything, even with gems attached. She passed around drawings, then moved on to explaining the efforts, failed so far, they'd taken to try to infuse the gemstone pillar. The only working fabrials were the lifts. I suggest, interrupted Elphabar, head of the storm wardens, that the ratio of the gears used in the lift machinery might be indicative of the nature of those who built it. It is the science of digitology, you see. You can judge much about a man by the width of his fingers. And this has to do with gears? How? Tishan found. In every way, Elphabar said. Why, the fact that you don't know this is a clear indication that you are a scribe. Your writing is pretty, Brightness, but you must give more heed to science. Pattern buzzed softly. I never have liked him, Shalon whispered. He acts nice around that part, but he's quite mean. So, which attribute of his are we totaling, and how many people are in the sample size? Pattern asked. Do you think, maybe, Yanela said, we are asking the wrong question? Shalon narrowed her eyes, but checked herself, suppressing her jealousy. There was no need to hate someone simply because they'd been close to me. It was just like something felt off about Yanela. Like many women at court, her laughter sounded rehearsed, contained, like they used it as a seasoning rather than actually feeling it. What do you mean, child? Adrotagia asked Yanela. Well, Brightness, we talk about the lift, the strange fabrical columns, the twisting hallways. We try to understand these things merely from their design. Maybe instead we should figure out the power's meaning, and then work backward to determine how these things might have met them. Navani said. Well, we know that they grew crops outside. Did some of these wall fabrials provide heat? Renarin mumbled something. Everyone in the room looked at him. Not a few seemed surprised to hear him speak, and he shrank back. What was that, Renarin? Navani asked. It's not like that, he said softly. They're not fabrials. They're a fabrial. The scribes and scholars shared looks. The prince, well, he often incited such reactions. Discomforted stares. Bright Lord? Yanela asked. Are you perhaps secretly an artifabrian? Studying engineering by night? Reading the winning script? Several of the others chuckled. Renarin blushed deeply, lowering his eyes farther. You'd never laugh like that at any other man of his rank, Shalon thought, feeling her cheeks grow hot. The Alethi court could be severely polite, but that didn't mean they were nice. Renarin always had been a more acceptable target than Dalinar or Adolin. Shalon's anger was a strange sensation. On more than one occasion, she'd been struck by Renarin's oddness. His presence at this meeting was just another example. Was he thinking of finally joining the Ardents? And he did that by simply showing up at a meeting for scribes, as if he were one of the women. At the same time, how dare Yanela embarrass him? Navani started to say something, but Shalon cut in. Surely, Yanela, you didn't just try to insult the son of the High Prince. What? No, of course I didn't. Good, Shalon said. Because if you had been trying to insult him, you did a terrible job. And I've heard that you're very clever. So full of wit and charm and other things. Yanela frowned at her. Is that flattery? We weren't talking of your chest, dear. We're speaking of your mind. Your wonderful, brilliant mind. So keen that it's never been sharpened. So quick it's still running when everyone else is done. So dazzling it's never failed to leave everyone in awe at the things you say. So, Yasna was glaring at her. Shalon held up her notebook. I took notes. Could we have a short break, Mother? Yasna asked. An excellent suggestion, Navani said. 15 minutes, during which everyone should consider a list of requirements this tower would have, if it were to somehow become self-sufficient. She rose, and the meeting broke up into individual conversations again. I see, Yasna said to Shalon, that you still use your tongue like a bludgeon rather than a knife. Yeah, Shalon sighed. Any tips? Yasna eyed her. You heard what she said to Renar in breakfast? And Mother was about to speak to her about it, Yasna said, discreetly with a judicious word. Instead, you threw a dictionary at her head. Sorry, she gets on my nerves. Yanela is a fool. Just bright enough to be proud of the wits she has, but stupid enough to be unaware of how outmatched they are. Yasna rubbed her temples. Storm. This is why I never take wards. Because they give you so much trouble. Because I'm bad at it. I have scientific evidence of that fact, and you are but the latest experiment. Yasna shooed her away, rubbing her temples. Shalon, feeling ashamed, walked to the side of the room while everyone else got refreshment. Pattern said as Shalon leaned against the wall, notebook held closer to her chest. Yasna doesn't seem angry. Why are you sad? Because I'm an idiot, Shalon said, and a fool, and because I don't know what I want. Hadn't it been only a week or two ago that she'd innocently assumed she had it figured out? Whatever it was. I can see him, said a voice to her side. Shalon jumped and turned to find Renarin staring at her skirt and the pattern there, which blended into her embroidery. Distinct if you knew to look, but easy to miss. He doesn't turn invisible, Renarin said. Because he can't. Renarin nodded, then looked up at her. Thank you. For defending my honor. When Adolin does that, someone usually gets stabbed. Your way was pleasanter. Well, nobody should take that tone with you. They wouldn't dare do it to Adolin. And besides, you're right. This place is one big fabrial. You feel it too? They keep talking about this device or that device, but that's wrong, isn't it? That's like taking the parts of a cart without realizing you've got a cart in the first place. Shalon leaned in. That thing we fought, Renarin. It could stretch its tendrils all the way up to the very top of your ceiling. I felt its wrongness wherever I went. That gemstone at the center is tied to everything. Yes, this isn't only a collection of fabrials. It's many fabrials put together to make one big fabrial. But what does it do? Shalon asked. It does being a city. He frowned. Well, I mean, it bees a city. It does what the city is. Shalon shivered. And the Unmade was running it, which let us discover this room in the fabrial column, Renarin said. We might not have accomplished that without it. Always look on the bright side. Logically, Shalon said, the bright side is the only side you can look on because the other side is dark. Renarin laughed. It brought to mind how her brothers would laugh at what she said. Maybe not because it was the most hilarious thing ever spoken, but because it was good to laugh. That reminded her of what Yasna had said, though, and Shalon found herself glancing at the woman. I know my cousin is intimidating, Renarin whispered to her. But you're a Radiant too, Shalon. Don't forget that. We could stand up to her if we wanted to. Do we want to? Renarin grimaced. Probably not. So often she's right, and you just end up feeling like one of the 10 fools. True, but I don't know if I can stand being ordered around like a child again. I'm starting to feel crazy. What do I do? Renarin shrugged. I found the best way to avoid doing what Yasna says is to not be around when she's looking for someone to give orders to. Shalon perked up. That made a lot of sense. Dalinar would need his radiance to go do things, right? She needed to get away, just until she could figure things out. Go somewhere. Like on that mission to Kholinar? Wouldn't they need someone who could sneak into the palace and activate the device? Renarin, she said, you're a genius. He blushed, but smiled. Navani called the meeting together again, and they sat and continued discussing Fabrials. Yasna tapped Shalon's notebook, and she did a better job of taking the minutes, practicing her shorthand. It wasn't nearly as irksome now as she had an exit strategy, an escape route. She was appreciating that when she noticed the tall figure striding through the door. Dalinar Kholin cast a shadow, even when he wasn't standing in front of the light. Everyone immediately hushed. Apologies for my tardiness. He glanced at his wrist and the four-arm timepiece that Navani had given him. Please don't stop because of me. Dalinar, Navani asked. You never attended a meeting of scribes before. I just thought I should watch, Dalinar said. Learn what this piece of my organization is doing. He settled down on a stool outside the room. He looked like a warhorse trying to perch on a stand meant for a show pony. They started up again. Everyone obviously self-conscious. She'd have thought that Dalinar would know to stay away from meetings like this, where women and scribes. Shalon cocked her head as she saw Renarin glance at his father. Dalinar responded with a raised fist. He came so Renarin wouldn't feel awkward, Shalon realized. It can't be improper or feminine for the prince to be here if the storming Blackthorn decides to attend. She didn't miss the way that Renarin actually raised his eyes to watch the rest of the proceeding.
45. A revelation. As the waves of the sea must continue to surge, so must our will continue resolute. Alone. The Voidbringers carried Moash to Revelar, a city in central Alethkar. Once there, they dropped him outside the city and shoved him toward a group of lesser Parshmen. His arms ached from being carried. Why hadn't they used their powers to lash him upward and make him lighter as Kaladin would have? He stretched his arms, looking around. He'd been to Revelar many times, working a regular caravan to Kholinar. Unfortunately, that didn't mean he'd seen much of the city. Every city of size had a little huddle of buildings on the outskirts for people like him. Modern-day nomads who worked caravans or ran deliveries. The people of the Eves, some had called them. Men and women who hovered close enough to civilization to get out of the weather when it turned bad, but who never really belonged. From the looks of things, Revelar had quite the Eves culture now. Too much of one. The Voidbringers seemed to have taken over the entire storming place, exiling the humans to the outskirts. The Voidbringers left him without a word, despite having lugged him all this distance. The Parshmen who took custody of him here looked like a hybrid between Parshendi warriors and the normal docile Parshmen he'd known from many a caravan run. They spoke perfect Alethi as they shoved him toward a group of humans in a little pen. Moash settled in to wait. It looked like the Voidbringers had patrols scouting the area, grabbing human stragglers. Eventually, the Parshmen herded him and the others toward one of the larger storm bunkers outside the city, used for housing armies or multiple caravans during high storms. Don't make trouble, a harsh woman said, specifically eyeing Moash. Don't fight or you'll be killed. Don't run or you'll be beaten. You're the slaves now. Several of the humans, homesteaders from the looks of it, started weeping. They clutched meager bundles, which Parshman searched through. Moash could read the signs of their loss in their rented eyes and ragged possessions. The Everstorm had wiped out their farm. They'd come to the big city looking for refuge. He had nothing on him of value, not any longer, and Parshman let him go in before the others. He walked into the bunker feeling a surreal sense of abandonment. He'd spent the trip here, alternately assuming he'd be executed or interrogated. Instead, they'd made a common slave of him. Even in Sadius's army, he'd never technically been a slave. Assigned to bridge runs, yes, sent to die. But he'd never worn the brands on his forehead. He felt the bridge 4 tattoo under his shirt on his left shoulder. The vast high-ceilinged storm bunker was shaped like a huge stone globe. Moash ambled through it, hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Huddled groups of people regarded him with hostility, even though he was just another refugee. He'd always been met with hostility, no matter where his story went. A youth like him, too big and obviously too confident for a dark eyes, had been considered a threat. He'd joined the caravans to give himself something productive to do, encouraged by his grandparents. They'd been murdered in their kindly ways, and Moash, he'd spent his life putting up with looks like that. A man on his own, a man you couldn't control, was dangerous. He was inherently frightening, just because of who he was, that nobody would ever let him in. Except Bridge 4. Well, Bridge 4 had been a special case, and he'd failed that test. Graves had been right to tell him to cut the patch off. This was who he really was. The man everyone looked at with distrust, pulling their children tight and nodding for him to move along. He stalked down the middle of the structure, which was so wide it needed pillars to hold up the ceiling. Those rose like trees, soul-cast right into the rock below. The edges of the building were crowded with people, but the center was kept clear and patrolled by armed Parshmen. They'd set up stations with wagons as perches where Parshmen were addressing crowds. Moash went over to one. In case we missed any, the Parshman shouted, experienced farmers should report to Brew at the front end of the chamber. He will assign you a plot of land to work. Today we also need workers to carry water in the city, and more to clear debris from the last storm. I could take 20 of each. Men started calling out their willingness, and Moash frowned, being for a man nearby. They offer us work. Aren't we slaves? Yeah, the man said. Slaves who don't eat unless they work. They let us choose what we want to do, though it's not much of a storming choice, one kind of drudgery or another. With a start, Moash realized that the man had pale green eyes, yet he still raised his hand and volunteered to carry water, something that had once been Parshman work. Well, that was a sight that couldn't help but brighten a man's day. Moash shoved hands back in pockets and continued through the room, checking each of the 3 stations where Parshmen offered jobs. Something about these Parshmen and their perfect alethi unsettled him. The Voidbringers were what he'd expected, with their alien accents and dramatic powers. But the ordinary Parshmen, many of them looked like Ashendi now, with those taller builds, seemed almost as bewildered at their reversal in fortune as the humans were. Each of the 3 stations dealt with a different category of labor. The one at the far end was looking for farmers, women with sewing skill and cobblers. Food, uniforms, boots. Parshmen were preparing for war. Asking around, Moash learned they'd already grabbed the smiths, fletchers, and armorers. And if you were found hiding skill in any of these 3, your whole family would be put on half rations. The middle station was for basic labor, hauling water, cleaning, cooking food. The last station was the most interesting to Moash. This was for hard labor, He lingered here, listening to a parchment ask for volunteers to pull wagons of supplies with the army when it marched. Apparently, there weren't enough chulls to move wagons for what was coming. Nobody raised their hands for this one. It sounded like ghastly work, not to mention the fact that it would mean marching toward battle. Then we could press the people into this, Moash thought. Maybe they can round up some light eyes and make them trudge across the rock like beasts of burden. He'd like to see that. As he left this last station, Moash spotted a group of men with long staffs leaning against the wall. Sturdy boots, water skins, and holsters tied to their thighs and a walking kit sewn into the trousers on the other side. He knew from experience what that would carry. A bowl, spoon, cup, thread, needle patches, and some flint and tinder. Carabineers. The long staffs were for slapping chull shells while walking beside them. He'd worn an outfit like that many times, though many of the caravans he worked had used parchment to pull wagons instead of chulls. They were faster. Hey, he said, strolling over to the carabineers. Is Gus still around? Gus? One of the carabineers said. Old wheelwright, apple-reed tall, bad at cussing? That's him. I think he's over there, the young man said, pointing with his staff. In the tents. But there ain't work, friend. The shellheads are marching, Moash said, looking over his shoulder. They'll need carabineers. Positions are full, another of the men said. There was a fight to see who got those jobs. Everyone else will be pulling wagons. Don't draw too much attention or they'll slap a harness on you and mark my words. They smiled in a friendly way, and Moash gave them an old caravaner's salute, close enough to a rude gesture that everyone else mistook it, and strode in the direction they pointed. Typical. Caravaneers were a big family and, like a family, prone to squabbling. The tents were really some sections of cloth that had been stretched from the wall to poles driven into buckets of rocks to keep them steady. That made a kind of tunnel along the wall here, and underneath a lot of older people coughed and sniffled. It was dim, with only the occasional chip on an overturned box giving light. He picked out the carabineers by their accents. He asked after Guff, who was one of the men he'd known back in the day and was allowed to penetrate deeper along the shadowy tent tunnel. Eventually, Moash found old Guff sitting right in the middle of the tunnel, as if to keep people from going farther. He had been sanding a piece of wood, an axle by the looks of it. He squinted as Moash stepped up. Moash, he said. Really? What storm brought you here? You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Moash said, squatting down beside the old man. You were on Jam's caravan, Guff said. Off to the Shattered Plains. Gave you all up for dead. Wouldn't have bet a dumb chip on you returning. A wise enough bet, Moash said. He hunched forward, resting his arms on his knees. In this tunnel, the buzz of people outside seemed distant, though only cloth separated them. Son, Guff asked, why are you here, boy? What do you want? I just need to be who I was. That makes as much sense as the Storm and Stormfather playing the flute, boy. But you wouldn't be the first to go off to those plains and come back not all right. No, you wouldn't. That's the Stormfather's storming own truth, that storming is. They tried to break me. Damnation, they did break me. Then he made me again. A new man. Moash paused. Sure, I'll wait. Sure, Guff said. I always do that, Moash whispered. Why must we always take something precious, Guff, and find ourselves hating it? As if by being pure, it reminds us of just how little we deserve it. I held the spear, and I stabbed myself with it. Spear? Guff asked. Boy, you a storming soldier. Moash looked at him with a start, then stood up, stretching, showing his patchless uniform coat. Guff squinted in the dark. failed wheelwright rose with difficulty and set a piece of wood on his chair. He led Moash with a rickety gate farther into the closet tunnel, and they entered a portion of the tented area that was more room-like, the far corner of the large bunker. Here, a group of maybe a dozen people sat in furtive conversation, chairs pulled together. The man at the door grabbed Guff by the arm as he shuffled in. Guff, you're supposed to be on guard, fool man. I'm storming on storming guard, you pisser, Guff said, shaking his arm free. The Bright wanted to know if we found any soldiers. Well, I found our storming soldiers, so storm on. The guard kept his attention to Moash, then flicked his eyes to Moash's shoulder. Deserter? Moash nodded. It was true in more ways than one. What's this? One of the men stood up, a tall fellow. Something about his silhouette, that bald head, that dark clothing. Deserter, Bright Lord, the guard said. From the shattered flames, not that. My lord, Moash realized. Aladar, Lama's kinsman and regent, a notoriously harsh man. In years past, he had nearly run the city to the ground, driving away many dark eyes who had the right of travel. Not a caravan had passed when someone had complained about Aladar's greed and corruption. From the shattered plains, you say, Aladar said. Excellent. Tell me, deserter, what news is there from the High Princes? Do they know of my plight here? Can I expect aid soon? They put him in charge, Moash thought, spying other light eyes. They wore fine clothing, not silks, of course, but well-trimmed uniforms, exceptional boots. There was food aplenty set out at the side of this chamber, while those outside scrounged and did heavy labor. He'd begun to hope, but of course that had been stupid. The arrival of the Voidbringers hadn't cast the light eyes down. The few Moash had seen outside were merely the sacrifices. The glowing dark eyes of the periphery confirmed this. Soldiers, guards, some favored merchants. To damnation with them. They'd been given a chance to escape from the light eyes, and it had only made them more eager to be servants. In that moment, surrounded by the pettiness that was his own kind, Moash had a revelation. He wasn't broken. All of them were broken. Alethi society, light-eyed and dark. Maybe all of humankind. Well, the regent demanded. Speak up, man. Moash remained silent, overwhelmed. He wasn't the exception, always ruining what he was given. Men like Paladin were the exception. The very, very rare exception. These people proved it. There was no reason to obey light eyes. They had no power, no authority. Men had taken opportunity and cast it to the crap. I think there's something wrong with him, Bright Lord, the guard said. Yeah, got that. Maybe it mentioned he's storming strange in the head now. Storming pisser. Oh, the regent said, pointing at Moash. Have that one thrown out. We haven't time for foolishness if we have to restore my place. He pointed at Guff. Have that one beaten. And post a competent guard next time, kid, or you'll be next. Old Guff cried out as they seized him. Moash just nodded. Yes, of course. That was what they would do. The guards took him under the arms and dragged him to the side of the tent. They parted the cloth and hauled him out. They passed a frazzled woman trying to divide a single piece of flatbread between three young crying children. You could probably hear their weeping from the Bright Lord's tent, where he had a stack of bread piled high. The guards threw him back out into the street that ran down the middle of the large bunker. They told him to stay away, but Moash barely heard. He picked himself up, dusted himself off, then walked to the third of the workstations, the one seeking hard laborers. There he volunteered for the most difficult job they had, pulling wagons of supplies for the Voidbringer army. 46. else from us. We need not suffer the interference of another. Race is contained, and we care not for his person. Scar the Bridgeman ran up the ramps outside Urathiru, breath puffing in the cold air as he silently counted his steps to maintain focus. The air was thinner up here at Urathiru, and that made running harder, though he really only noticed it outside. He wore full marching pack and gear, rations, equipment, helmet, jerkin, and a shield tied to the back. He carried his spear and even had some greaves stuck to his legs, held in place by the shape of the metal. All of that weighed almost as much as he did. He finally hit the top of the arcade platform. Storms, like the scented building, looked farther away than he remembered. He tried to pick up his pace anyway and jogged for all he was worth, the pack clinking. Finally, sweating, breath growing ragged, he reached the control building and dashed inside. He finally pulled to a stop, dropping his spear and resting his hands on his knees, gasping for breath. Most of Bridge 4 waited here, sun glowing with stormlight. Of them all, Scar was the only one who, despite 2 weeks of practice, still hadn't figured out how to draw it in. Well, except for David and Relaine. Sigil checked the plot they'd been allocated by Hermione Colvin, a device the size of a small box. That was about 10 minutes, he said. Just under. Scar nodded and wiped his brow. He'd run over a mile from the center of the market, then crossed the plateau and charged the ramp. Storms. He pushed himself too hard. How long? He said, gasping. How long did it take Ray? The two had set out together. Sigil glanced at the tall, muscled Bridgeman who still glowed with residual stormlight. After 6 minutes, Scar groaned, sitting down. The baseline is equally important, Scar, Sigil said, making glyphs in his notebook. We need to know a normal man's abilities to make comparisons. Don't worry, though. I'm sure you'll figure out stormlight soon. Scar popped backward, looking up. Logan was walking around on the ceiling of the room, storm-haired dancing. Tricky. You used a quarter of a basic lashing by Kaladin's terminology? Sigil continued, still making notes. Yeah, Brady said. I know the precise amount, Sig. Strange. Which made you half as heavy as usual when we put you on the scale back in the rooms. But why? Does a quarter lashing make you half as heavy? Shouldn't it make you 25% as heavy? Does it matter? Brady asked. Sigil looked at him as if he were crazy. Of course it does. I want to try a lashing at an angle next, Brady said. See if I can make it feel like I'm running downhill, no matter which direction I go. Might not need it. Holding Stormlight, it made me feel like I could run forever. Well, it's a new record, Sigil mumbled, still writing. You beat Logan's time. Did he beat mine? Layton called from the side of the room where he was inspecting the tiling on the floor. You stopped for food on the way, Layton, Sigil said. Even Rock beat your type, and he was skipping like a girl the last third. Was only the dance of victory, Rock said from near Layton. He's very manly. Manly or not, it threw off my test, Sigil said. At least Scar is willing to pay attention to proper procedure. Scar remained lying on the ground as the others chatted. Kaladin was supposed to come and transport them to the shattered plains, and Sigil had decided to run some tests. Kaladin, as usual, was late. Ted sat down next to Scar, inspecting him with dark green eyes with bags underneath. Kaladin had named the two of them lieutenants, along with Rock and Sigil, but their roles had never really settled into that ranking. Ted was the perfect definition of a platoon sergeant. Here, Ted said, handing over a chowder. Meatballs wrapped in flatbread, Cardassian style. Layton brought food. Eat something, lad. Ted forced himself to sit up. I'm not that much younger than you, Teft. I'm hardly a lad. Teft nodded to himself, chewing on his own chowder. Finally, Scar started into his. It was good. Not spicy like a lot of Alethi food, but still good. Flavorful. Everyone keeps telling me that I'll get it soon, Scar said. But what if I don't? There won't be room in the Windrunners for a lieutenant who has to walk everywhere. eating lunch with a rock. Ain't nothing wrong with being on the support team. Pardon, Sarge, but storm that. Do you know how long I waited to hold a spear? Scar picked up the weapon from beside his pack and laid it across his lap. I'm good at it. I can fight, only Lopen left the ceiling, rotating to get his legs under him and floating gently to the floor. He laughed as Bissig, in turn, tried flying up to the ceiling and crashed headfirst into it. Bissig hopped to his feet, looking down at them all, embarrassed. But what did he have to be embarrassed about? He was standing on the ceiling. You were in the military before, Taft guessed. No, but not for lack of trying. You were the Black Caps, Paladar's personal guards. Let's just say they didn't think much of my application. Yes, we had dark guys in, but not runts. Taft grunted, chewing on his shotgun. Then I might reconsider if I quit myself, Scar said. You don't know how much fun lacrosse is. That was a stupid rock splitter with visions of battlefield glory. It used to be they'd never speak about their pasts. That had changed, though Scar couldn't specify exactly when. It came out as part of the catharsis of having become something greater. Taft was an addict. Drehy had struck an officer. F had been caught planning to desert with his brother. Even simple Hopper had been part of a drunken brawl. Knowing Hopper, he'd probably only gone along with what his squad was doing, but a man had ended up dead. You'd think, Taft said, that our high and mighty leader would have gotten here by now. I swear, Calvin and I speak my eyes every day. Don't let him hear you say that, Scar said. I'll say what I want, Taft snapped. If that boy's not going to come, maybe I should be going. I have things to do. Scar hesitated, glancing up at Taft. Not that, Taft growled. I've barely touched the stuff for days. You'd think a man had never had a wild night out the way you're all treating me. You didn't say a thing, Taft. Knowing what we've suffered, it's insane to think that we wouldn't need something to get us through the day. The moss isn't the problem. It's the storming world going all crazy. That's the problem. Sure is, Taft. Taft nodded, then studied his cello roll intently. So, how long have the men known? I mean, did anyone? Not long, Scar said quickly. Nobody's even thinking about it. Taft nodded and didn't see through the lie. The truth was, most of them had noticed Taft sneaking off to grind a little moss now and then. It wasn't uncommon in the army. But doing what he'd done, missing duty, selling his uniform, ending up in an alley, that was different. It was the sort of thing that could get you discharged at best. At worst, well, it might get you assigned to bridge duty. The trouble was, they weren't common soldiers anymore. They weren't light eyes either. There was something strange, something that nobody understood. I don't want to talk about this, I said. Look, weren't we discussing how to get you to blow? That's the problem at hand. Before he could press further, Paladin Stormblast finally deigned to arrive, bringing with them the scouts and locals of other rich groups who had been trying to draw in Stormlight. So far, nobody except men from Bridge 4 had managed it. But that included a few that had never actually run bridges. Uyo and Unyo, Lopen's cousins, and men like Cohen from the old Cobalt Guard who had been recruited in Bridge 4 a couple months back. So there was still hope that others could manage it. Kaladin had brought roughly 30 people beyond those who had already been trained on the team. Judging by their uniform patches, this 30 had come from other divisions, and some were light-eyed. Kaladin had mentioned asking General Kyle to round up the most promising potential recruits from throughout the Allied army. All here, Kaladin said. Good. He strode to the side of the single-roomed control building, a sack of glowing gemstones slung over his shoulder. His magnificent shark blade appeared in his hand, and he slid into the keyhole in the chamber wall. Kaladin engaged the ancient mechanism, pushing the sword, entire inner wall, which would rotate toward a specific point marked by murals. The floor began to glow, and outside stormlight rose in a swirl around the entire stone plateau. Kaladin locked the blade into place at the mark on the floor designated the Shattered Plains. When the glow faded, they'd come to Narak. Sigzo left his pack of armor leaning against the wall and strode out. Best they could determine, the entire stone top of the platform had come with them, swapping places with the one that had been out here. At the platform edge, a group of people climbed across the rim to meet them. A short, collected woman named Christina counted out the bridgemen and soldiers as they passed, marking on her ledger. "Took you long enough, right, Lord?" She nodded to Kaladin, whose eyes glowed faintly blue. The merchants were beginning to complain. It took stormlight to power the device. Some of the gemstones in Kaladin's sack would have been drained by the process. But curiously, it didn't take much more to swap two groups than it did to travel one way. So they tried to run the oath gates when they had people on both sides wanting to exchange places. Tell merchants when they next come through, Kaladin said, that the Knights Radiant are not their doormen. They'll want to accustom themselves to waiting unless they find a way to swear the oaths themselves. Christina smirked and wrote it down as if she were going to pass on that exact message. I smiled at that. Nice to see a scribe with a sense of humor. Kaladin led the way through the city of Narak, once a Parshendi stronghold, now an increasingly important human way stop between the war camp and Thiru. The buildings here were surprisingly sturdy, well constructed of prem and carved great shell carapace. Skard always assumed the Parshendi to be like the nomads who roved between Asia and Yakabet. He imagined Parshendi who were wild and ferocious, without civilization, hiding in caves for storms. Yet here was a well-built, carefully laid out city. They found a building full of artwork from a style that Mathilde describes. Parchment art. They'd been painting even while they fought a war, just like ordinary people. He glanced at Shen, no, Relaine. It was hard to remember, walking with spear to his shoulder. Scar forgot he was there most of the time, and that made him ashamed. Relaine was as much a member of Bridge 4 as anyone else, right? But he'd rather have been painting than fighting. They passed the sentry posts full of Dalinar's soldiers, along with many in red and light blue, Ruthar's colors. Dalinar was putting some of the other soldiers to work, trying to prevent more dust-ups between soldiers from different princedoms. Without the fighting on the Shattered Plains to keep them focused, the men were getting restless. They passed a large group of soldiers practicing with bridges on a nearby plateau. Scar couldn't hold back a grin as he saw their black uniforms and helmets. Plateau runs had been started again, but with more structure, and the spoils were shared equally among the high princes. Today it was the Black Cap's turn. Scar wondered if any of them would recognize him. Probably not, even if he hadn't caused quite a ruckus among them. There had been only one logical way to get the equipment he needed for his application. He'd stolen it from the Black Cap quartermaster. Scar had thought they would praise his ingenuity. He was so eager to be a Black Cap they'd go to great lengths to join them, right? Wrong. His reward had been a slave brand and eventual sale to Sadeas's army. He brushed his fingers across the scars on his forehead. Stormlight had healed the brands of the other men. They'd covered them all up with tattoos anyway. But it seemed another little dig, dividing him from the others. Right now, he was the only fighting man in Breach 4 who still had his slave brand. Well, him and Kaladin, whose scars wouldn't heal for some reason. They reached the training plateau, crossing the old Bridge 4, which was held in place with some soul-cast rock guideposts. Kaladin called a meeting of the officers as several of Rock's children set up a water station. The tall Horn-Eater seemed beyond enthused to have his family working with him. Scar joined Kaladin's Zigzaltep and Rock. Though they stood close, there was a conspicuous gap where Moash should have been. It felt so wrong to have him in Bridge 4 It's only been 2 weeks, sir, Sigzel said. True, but still things several feel right. Though she won't tell me who, as she says it would be wrong. Kaladin gestured toward the newcomers. I asked Carl to send me another batch of hopefuls because I figured the more people we have, the better our chances of finding new squires. He paused. I didn't specify they couldn't be light-eyed. Perhaps I should have. Don't see why, sir, Scar said, pointing. That's Captain Kolat. Good man. He helped us explore. Just wouldn't feel right having light-eyed men in Bridge 4. Other than you? Scar asked. And Renara? And well, any of us who earn our own blades. And maybe Rock, who I think might have been light-eyed among his people, even if he has dark. Fine, Scar, Kaladin said. Point made. Anyway, we don't have a lot of time left before I leave for Elokar. I'd like to push the recruits harder, see if they're likely to be able to swear the oaths. Any thoughts? Shove them off edge of plateau, Rock said. Those who fly, we let in. Any serious suggestions? Kaladin asked. Let me run them through some formations, Teft said. A good idea, Kaladin said. Storms, I wish we knew how the Radiants used to handle expansion. Were there recruitment drives, or did they just wait until someone attracted a sprint? I wouldn't make them a squire, though, Teft said, rubbing his chin. We're a full Radiant, right? A valid point, Sigzel said. We have no proof that we squires are a step toward becoming full Radiants. We might always be your support team. And in that case, it's not individual skill that matters, but your decision. Maybe that of your spring. You choose them, they serve under you, and then they start drawing in Stormlight. Yeah, Scar said, uncomfortable. They all glanced at him. The first of you that says something placating, Scar said, gets a fist in the face. Or the stomach if I can't reach your storming stupid horn in your face. Rock said. You could hit my face, Scar. I have seen you jump very high. Almost you seem as tall as regular person when you do that. Teft, Kaladin said. Go ahead and run those potential recruits through formations. And tell the rest of the men to watch the sky. I'm worried about more raids in the caravans. He shook his head. Something about those raids doesn't add up. The war camp's parshmen, by all reports, have marched to Alethkar. But why would those fused keep harrying us? They won't have the troops to take advantage of any supply problems they cause. Scar shared a glance with Sigzel, who shrugged. Kaladin talked like this sometimes, differently from the rest of them. He trained them in formations and the spear, and they could proudly call themselves soldiers. But they'd only actually fought a few times. What did they know of things like strategy and battlefield tactics? They broke, Teft jogging off to drill the potential recruits. Kaladin set Bridge 4 to studying their flying. They practiced landings and then did sprints in the air, zipping back and forth in formation, getting used to changing directions quickly. It was a little distracting, seeing those glowing lines of light shoot through the sky. Scar attended Kaladin as he observed the recruits doing formations. The Light Eyes didn't voice a single complaint about being filed into ranks with Dark Eyes. Kaladin and Teft, well, all of them really, had a tendency to act as if every light-eyed man was in some way regal. But there were far, far more of them who did normal jobs, though granted they got paid better for those jobs than a dark-eyed man did. Kaladin watched, then glanced at the Bridge 4 in the sky. I wonder, Scar, he said, how important our formation is going to be for us going forward. Can we devise new ones to use in flying? Everything changes when your enemy can attack from all sides. After about an hour, Scar went for water and enjoyed some good-natured ribbing from the others who landed to grab something to drink. He didn't mind. What you had to watch out for was when Bridge 4 didn't torment you. The others took off a short time later, and Scar watched them go, launching into the sky. He took a long draught of Rock's current refreshment. He called it tea, but it tasted like boiled grain, and found himself feeling useless. With these people, these new recruits going to start glowing and take his place in Bridge 4? Would he be shuffled off to other duties while someone else laughed with the crew and got ribbed for their height? Storm it, he thought, tossing aside his cup. I hate feeling sorry for myself. He hadn't sulked when the Black Caps had turned him down, and he wouldn't sulk now. He was fishing in his pocket for gemstones, determined to practice some more, when he spotted Lynn sitting on a rock nearby, watching the recruits run formations. She was slouching, and he read frustration in her posture. Well, he knew that feeling. Scar shouldered his spear and sauntered over. The 4 other scout women had gone to the water station. Rock let out a bellowing laugh as one of them said, "Not joining in?" Scar asked, nodding toward the new recruits marching past. "I don't know formation, Scar. I've never done drills, never even held a storming spear. I ran messages and scouted the planes." She sighed. "I didn't pick it up fast enough, did I? He's gone and gotten some new people to test since I failed." "Don't be stupid," Scar said, sitting beside her on the large rock. "You're not being forced out. Kaladin just wants to have as many potential recruits as possible." She shook her head. "Everyone knows that we're in a new world now. A world where rank and eye color don't matter. Something glorious." She looked up at the sky and the men training there. "I want to be part of it, Scar. So badly." "Yeah." She looked at him, probably saw it in his eyes, that same emotion. "Storms, I hadn't even thought, Scar. Must be worse for you." He shrugged and reached into his pouch, taking out an emerald as big as his thumb. It shone fiercely, even in the bright daylight. "You ever hear about the first time Captain Stormbless drew in light?" "He told us that day after he knew he could do it because Tef told him, and not that day." "You mean while he was healing?" she said. "After the high storm where he was strung up?" "Not that day either," Scar said, holding up the gemstone. Through it, he saw men running formations and imagined them carrying a bridge. "I was there. Second row. Bridge run. They had one. We were charging the plateau and a lot of Parshendi had set up. They dropped most of the first row, all but Kaladin. That exposed me, right beside the second row. In those days, you didn't have good odds running near the front. The Parshendi wanted to take down our bridge, and they focused their shots on us, on me. I knew I was dead. I knew it. I saw the arrows coming, and I breathed the last prayer, hoping the next flight wouldn't be quite so bad. Then the arrows moved, Lynn. They storming swerved toward Kaladin." He turned the emerald over and shook his head. "There's a special lashing you can do, which makes things curve in the air. Kaladin painted the wood above his hands with stormlight and drew the arrows toward him instead of me. That's the first time I can say I knew something special was happening." He lowered the gemstone and pressed it into her hand. "Back then, Kaladin did it without even knowing what he was doing. Maybe we're just trying too hard, you know? But it doesn't make sense. They say you have to suck it in. What does that even mean?" "No idea," Scar said. "They each describe it differently, and it's breaking my brain trying to figure it out. They talk about a sharp intake of breath, only not really breathing, which is perfectly clear." "Tell me about it," Scar said, tapping the gemstone in her palm. "It worked best for Kaladin when he didn't stress. It was harder when he focused on making it happen. So I'm supposed to accidentally but deliberately breathe something in without breathing, but not try too hard at it? Doesn't it just make you want to string up the lot of them in the storms? But their advice is all we got. So..." She looked at the stone, then held it close to her face. That didn't seem to be important, but what could it hurt? And breathed in. Nothing happened. So she tried again, and again, for a solid 10, and again, for a solid 10 minutes. "I don't know, Scar," she finally said, lowering the stone. "I keep thinking maybe I don't belong here. If you haven't noticed, none of the women have managed this. I kind of forced my way among you all, and nobody asked. Stop, he said, taking the emerald and holding it before her again. Stop right there. You want to be a windrunner? More than anything, she whispered. Why? Because I want to soar. Not good enough. Kaladin, he wasn't thinking about being left out or how great it would be to fly. He was thinking about saving the rest of us. Saving me. Why do you want to be in the Windrunners? Because I want to help. I want to do something other than stand around waiting for the enemy to come to us. Well, you have a chance, Lynn. A chance nobody has had for ages. A chance in millions. Either you seize it, and in so doing decide you're worthy, or you leave and give up. He pressed the gemstone back down into her hand. But if you leave, you don't get to complain. As long as you keep trying, there's a chance. When you give up, that's when the dream dies. She met his eyes, closed her fist around the gemstone, and breathed in with a sharp, distinct breath. Then started glowing. She yelped in surprise and opened her hand to find the gemstone within done. She looked at him in awe. What did you do? Nothing, Scar said, which was the problem. Still, he found he couldn't be jealous. Maybe this was his lot, helping others become Radiants. A trainer, a facilitator. Tet saw Lynn glowing, then dashed over and started cursing. But they were good Tet curses. He grabbed her by the arm and towed her toward Kaladin. Scar took in a long, satisfied breath. Well, that was two he'd helped so far, counting Rock. He could live with that, couldn't he? He strolled over to the drink station and got another cup. What is this foul stuff, Rock? He asked. You didn't mistake the washing water for tea, did you? His old ornate recipe, he said, has proud tradition. Like skipping? Like formal war dance, he said, and hitting annoying bridgemen on the head for not showing proper respect. Scar turned around and leaned one hand on the table, watching Lynn's enthusiasm as her squad scouts ran up to her. He felt good about what he'd done. Strangely good. Excited even. I think I'm going to have to get used to smelly Hornator's Rock, Scar said. I'm thinking of joining your support team. You think I will let you anywhere near Cookpot? I might not ever learn to fly. He squished the part of him that whispered at that. I need to come to terms with the fact, so I'll have to find another way to help out. Ha! And the fact that you are glowing with Stormlight right now is not at all consideration and decision? Scar froze. Then he focused on his hand, right in front of his face, holding a cup. Tiny wisps of Stormlight curled over it. He dropped the cup with a cry, digging from his pocket a couple of dumb chips. He'd given his practice gemstone to Lynn. He looked up at Rock, then grinned stupidly. I suppose, Rock said, I can maybe have you wash dishes, though you do keep throwing my cups on the ground. It's not proper respect at all. He trailed off as Scar left him, running for the others and whooping with excitement.
47. So much is lost. Indeed, we admire his initiative. Perhaps if you had approached the correct one of us with your plea, it would have found favorable audience. I am Talanal Elin, herald of war. The time of your return to desolation is near at hand. We must prepare. You will have forgotten much following the destruction of the times past. Kalak will teach you to cast bronze, if you have forgotten this. We will soul cast blocks of metal directly for you. I wish we could teach you steel, but casting is so much easier than forging, and you must have something you can produce quickly. Your stone tools will not serve against what is to come. Fidel can train your surgeons, and Jezreel will teach you leadership. So much is lost between returns. I will train your soldiers when you have time. Bashar keeps talking about a way to keep information from being lost following desolations. And you have discovered something unexpected. We will use that. Surge binders to act as guardians. Knights. The coming days will be difficult. But with training, humanity will survive. You must bring me to your leaders. The other heralds should join us soon. I think I am late this time. I fear, oh God, that I have failed. No, this is not right, is it? How long has it been? Where am I? I am Talanel Elin, Herald of War. The time of the return, the desolation is near at hand. Yasna trembled as she read the madman's words. She turned over the sheet and found the next one covered in similar ideas, repeated over and over. This couldn't be a coincidence, and the words were too specific. The abandoned herald had come to Kholinar and had been dismissed as a madman. She leaned back in her seat, and Ivory, full size, like a human, stepped over to the table. Hands clasped behind his back, he wore his usual stiff, formal suit. The Spren's coloring was jet black, both clothing and features, though something prismatic swirled on his skin. It was as if pure black marble had been coated in oil that glistened with hidden color. He rubbed his chin, reading the words. Yasna had rejected the nice rooms with balconies on the rim of Urifiru. Those had such an obvious entrance for assassins or spies. Her small room at the center of Dalinar's section was far more secure. She had stuffed the ventilation openings with cloth. The airflow from the hallway outside was adequate for this room, and she wanted to make sure nobody could overhear her by listening through the shafts. In the corner of her room, 3 span reeds worked tirelessly. She had rented them at great expense until she could acquire new ones of her own. They were paired with reeds in tache that had been delivered to one of the finest and most trustworthy information centers in the princedom. There, miles and miles away, a scribe was carefully rewriting each page of her notes, which she had originally sent to them to keep safe. This speaker, Yasna, Ivory said, tapping the sheet she'd just read. Ivory had a clipped, no-nonsense voice. This one who said these words. This person is a herald. Our suspicions are true. The heralds are, and the fallen one still is. We need to find him, Yasna said. We must search Shadesmar, Ivory said. In this world, men can hide easily, but their souls shine out to us on the other side, unless someone knows how to hide them. Ivory looked toward the growing stack of notes in the corner. One of the pens had finished writing. Yasna rose to change the paper. Shallan had rescued one of her trunks of notes, but 2 others had gone down with the sinking ship. Fortunately, Yasna had sent off these backup copies. Or did it matter? This sheet, encrypted by her cipher, contained lines and lines of information connecting the Parshmen to the Voidbringers. Once, she'd slaved over each of these passages, teasing them from history. Now their contents were common knowledge. In one moment, all of her expertise had been wiped away. We've lost so much time, she said. Yes, we must catch what we have lost, Yasna. We must. The enemy? Yasna asked. He stirs. He angers. Ivory shook his head, kneeling beside her as he changed the sheets of paper. We are not before him, Yasna. He would destroy my kind and yours. The span reed finished, and another started writing out the first lines of her memoirs, which she'd worked on intermittently. She'd thrown aside a dozen different attempts, and as she read this latest one, she found herself disliking it as well. What do you think of Shallan? She asked Ivory, shaking her head. The person she's become. Ivory frowned, lips drawing tight. His sharply chiseled features, too angular to be human, were like those of a roughed-out statue the sculptor had neglected to finish. She is troubling, he said. That much hasn't changed. She is not stable. Ivory, you think all humans are unstable. Not you. His chin. You are like a spren. You think by facts. You change not on simple whims. You are as you are. She gave him a flat stare. Mostly, he added. Mostly. But it is, Yasna. Compared to other humans, you are practically a stone. She sighed, standing up and brushing past him, returning to her writing desk. The herald's ravings glared at her. She settled down, feeling tired. Yasna, Ivory asked. Am I in error? I am not so much a stone as you think, Ivory. Sometimes I wish I were. These words trouble you, he said, stepping up to her again and resting his jet black fingers on the paper. Why? You have read many troubling things. Yasna settled back, listening to the 3 Spanreeds scratching paper, writing out notes that, she feared, would mostly be irrelevant. Something stirred deep within her. Glimmers of memory from a dark room, screaming her voice ragged. A childhood illness nobody else seemed to remember for all it had done to her. It had taught her that people she loved could still hurt her. Have you ever wondered how it would feel to lose your sanity, Ivory? Ivory nodded. I have wondered at this. How could I not? Considering what the ancient fathers are. You call me logical, whispered Yasna. It's untrue, but I let my passions rule me as much as many. In my times of peace, however, my mind has always been the one thing I could rely upon. Except once. She shook her head, picking up the paper again. I fear losing that, Ivory. It terrifies me. How would it have felt to be these heralds? To suffer your mind slowly becoming untrustworthy? Are they too far gone to know? Or are there lucid moments where they strain and sort through memories, trying frantically to decide which are reliable and which are fabrications? She shivered. The ancient ones, Ivory said again, nodding. He didn't often speak of the spren who had been lost during the recreance. Ivory and his fellows had been mere children, well, the spren equivalent at the time. They spent years, centuries, with no older spren to nurture and guide them. The ink spren were only now beginning to recover the culture and society they had lost when men abandoned their vows. Your ward, Ivory said, the spren, cryptic, which is bad. Ivory nodded. He preferred simple, straightforward gestures. You never saw Ivory shrug. Cryptics are trouble. They enjoy lies, yes, feast upon them. Speak one word untrue at a gathering and 7 cluster around you. Their humming fills your ears. Have you warred with them? One does not war with cryptics, as one does other spren. Cryptics have but one city, and do not wish to rule war, only to listen. He tapped the table. Perhaps this one is better with the bond. Ivory was the only new generation ink spren to form a radiant bond. Some of his fellows would rather have killed Yasna instead of letting him risk what he had done. The spren had a noble air about him, stiff-backed and commanding. He could change his size at will, but not his shape, except when fully in this realm, manifesting as a shard blade. He had taken the name Ivory as a symbol of defiance. He was not what his kin said he was, and would not suffer what fate proclaimed. The difference between a higher spren like him and a common emotion spren was in their ability to decide how to act. A living contradiction, like human beings. Shallan won't listen to me any longer, Yasna said. She rebels against every little thing I tell her. These last few months on her own have changed the child. She never obeyed well, Yasna. That is who she is. In the past, at least, she pretended to care about my teaching. But you have said, more humans should question their places in life. Did you not say that they too often accept presumed truth as fact? She tapped the table. You're right, of course. Wouldn't I rather have her straining against her boundaries as opposed to happily living within them? Whether she obeys me or not is of little import. But I do worry about her ability to command her situation, rather than letting her impulses command her. How do you change this, if it is? An excellent question. Yasna searched through the papers on her small table. She'd been collecting reports from her informants in the war camps, the ones who had survived, about Shallan. She'd truly done well in Yasna's absence. Perhaps what the child needed was not more structure, but more challenges. All 10 orders are again, Ivory said from behind her. For years it had been only the two of them, Yasna and Ivory. Ivory had been dodgy about giving odds on whether the other Sapiens friends would be found their orders or not. However, he'd always said that he was certain that the Honor Spren and therefore the Winged Runners would never return. Their attempts to rule Shadespar apparently not endeared them to the other races. 10 orders, Yasna said. All ended in death. All but one, Ivory agreed. They live in death instead. She turned around, and he met her eyes with his own. No pupils, just oil shimmering above something deep black. We must tell the others what we learned from Wynn, Ivory. Eventually, the secret must be known. Yasna, no. It would be the end. Another recreance. The truth has not destroyed you. You are special. No knowledge is that can destroy you, but the others. She held his eyes, then gathered the sheets and stacked beside her. We shall see, she said, then carried them to the table to bind them into a book.
48. Rhythm of work. But we stand in the sea, pleased with our domains. Leave us alone. Moash grunted as he crossed the uneven ground, hauling a thick, knotted cord over his shoulder. Turned out the Woodbringers had run out of wagons. Too many supplies to bring and not enough vehicles. At least, vehicles with wheels. Moash had been assigned to a sledge, a cart with broken wheels that had been repurposed with a pair of long steel skids. They'd put him first in the line, pulling their rope. The parchment overseers had considered him the most enthusiastic. Why wouldn't he be? The caravans moved at the slow pace of the chawls, which pulled roughly half the ordinary wagons. He had sturdy boots and even a pair of gloves. Compared to bridge duty, this was a paradise. The scenery was even better. Central Alethkar was far more fertile than the shattered plains, and the ground sprouted with bark buds and the gnarled roots of trees. The sledge bounced and crunched over these, but at least he didn't have to carry the thing on his shoulders. Around him, hundreds of men pulled wagons or sledges piled high with foodstuffs, freshly cut lumber, or leather made from hog's hide or eagle's skin. Some of the workers had collapsed on their first day out of Revelar. The Voidbringers had separated these into two groups. The ones who had tried, but were genuinely too weak, had been sent back to the city. A few deemed to be faking had been whipped, then moved to sledges instead of wagons. Harsh, but fair. Indeed, as the march continued, Moash was surprised at how well the human workers were treated. Though strict and unforgiving, the Voidbringers understood that to work hard, slaves needed good rations and plenty of time at night to rest. They weren't even chained up. Running away would be pointless under the watchful care of few stupid fly. Moash found himself enjoying these weeks hiking and pulling his sledge. It exhausted his body, quieted his thoughts, and let him fall into a calm rhythm. This was certainly far better than his days as a light eyes when he worried incessantly about the plot against the king. It felt good just to be told what to do. What happened to the Shattered Plains wasn't my fault, he thought as he pulled the sledge. I was pushed into it. I can't be blamed. These thoughts comforted him. He couldn't ignore their apparent destination. He'd walked this path dozens of times, running caravans with his uncle, even when he'd been a youth. Across the river, straight southeast, over Ishar's field, and cutting past the town of Inkwell. The Woodbringers were marching to take Kholinar. The caravan included tens of thousands of Parshmen armed with axes or spears. They wore what Moash now knew was called war form, a Parshman form with carapace armor and a strong physique.
Okay,
They were
baby.
experienced, watching their nightly training told them they were basically the equivalent of dark eyes scrounged from villages and pressed into the army. But they were learning, and they had access to the first. Those zipped through the air or strode along beside carts, powerful and imperious, and surrounded by dark energy. There seemed to be different varieties, but each was intimidating. Everything was converging on the capital. Should that bother him? After all, what had Kholinar ever done for him? It was the place where his grandparents had been left to die, cold and alone in a prison cell. It was where the blighted King Elhokar had danced and connived while good people rotted. Did humankind even deserve this kingdom? During his youth, he'd listened to traveling Martins who accompanied the caravans. He knew that long ago humankind had won. Aharietiam, the final confrontation with the Voidbringers, had happened thousands of years ago. What had they done with that victory? They'd set up false gods in the form of men whose eyes reminded them of the night's radiant. The life of men over the centuries had been nothing more than a long string of murders, wars, and thefts. The Voidbringers had obviously returned because men had proven they couldn't govern themselves. That was why the Almighty had set this scourge. Indeed, the more he marched, the more Moash admired the Voidbringers. The armies were efficient, and the troops learned quickly. The caravans were well supplied. When an overseer saw that Moash's boots were looking worn, he had a new pair by evening. Each wagon or sledge was given 2 Parshman overseers, but these were told to use their whips sparingly. They were quietly trained for the position, and Moash heard the occasional conversation between an overseer, once a Parshman slave, and an unseen spren who gave them directions. The Voidbringers were smart, driven, and efficient. If Kholinar fell to this force, it would be no more than humankind deserved. Yes, perhaps the time for his people had passed. Moash had failed Kaladin and the others, but that was merely how men were in this debased age. He couldn't be blamed. He was a product of his culture. Only one oddity marred his observations. The Voidbringers seemed so much better than the human armies they'd been part of, except for one thing. There was a group of Parshman slaves. They pulled one of the sledges and always walked apart from the humans. They wore workborn, not warform, though otherwise they looked exactly like the other Parshmen, with the same marble skin. Why did this group pull a sledge? At first, as Moash plodded across the endless plains of central Alethkar, he found the sight of them encouraging. It suggested that the Voidbringers could be egalitarian. Maybe there had simply been too few men with the strength to pull these sledges. Yet if that were so, why were these Parshman sledge pullers treated so poorly? The overseers did little to hide their disgust and were allowed to whip the poor creatures without restriction. Moash rarely glanced in their direction without finding one of them being beaten, yelled at, or abused. Moash's heart wrenched to see and hear this. Everyone else seemed to work so well together. Everything else about the army seemed so perfect. Except this. Who were these poor souls? The overseer called a break, and Noash dropped his robe, then took a long pull on his water skin. It was their 21st day of marching, which he only knew because some of the other slaves kept track. He judged the location of several days fasting. Stretched toward Coconut. The slaves and settled down in the shade of the The hedge which was piled high with cut timber, not far behind them.
Oh, that has been a very, very long
There hadn't been anyone in it,
session.
as word had gone before them.
Let me just do
Why had the board
a little more
no
shading
others they passed? Perhaps it was to send a message.
just there,
Indeed, that smoke trail was ominous.
and then I shall let you go.
Flanking armies from using the village. As his crew waited, Moash didn't know their names and hadn't bothered to ask. The Parshman crew trudged past, bloodied and whipped, their overseers yelling them onward. They'd lagged behind. Pervasive cruel treatment led to a tired crew, which in turn led them to being forced to march to catch up when everyone else got a water break. That, of course, only wore them out and caused injuries, which made them lag farther behind, which made them get whipped. That's what happened to Bridge 4 back before Kaladin, Moash thought. Everyone said we were unlucky, but it was just a self-perpetuating downward spiral. Once that crew passed, trailing a few exhaustion spread, one of Moash's overseers called for his team to take up their ropes and get moving again. She was a young Parshwoman with dark red skin, marbled only slightly with white. She wore a challah. Though it didn't seem like marching clothing, she wore it well. She had even done up the sleeve to cover her safe hand. "What'd they do anyway?" he said as he took up his rope. "What was that?" she asked, looking back at him. Storms. Save for that skin and the odd sing-song quality to her voice, she could have been a pretty Makabaki caravan girl. "That Parshman crew," he said. "What do they do to deserve such rough treatment?" He didn't actually expect an answer, but the Parshwoman followed his gaze, then shook her head. "They harbored a false god, brought him into the very center among us." "The Almighty?" She laughed. "A real false god, a living one, like our living gods." She looked up as one of the pews passed overhead. "There are lots who think the Almighty is real," Moash said. "If that's the case, why are you pulling a sledge?" She snapped her fingers, pointing. Moash picked up his rope, joining the other men in a double line. They merged with the enormous column of marching feet, scraping sledges and rattling wheels. The Parshendi wanted to arrive at the next town before an impending storm. They weathered both types, high storm and everstorm, sheltering in villages along the way. Moash fell into the steady rhythm of the work. It wasn't long until he was sweating. He'd grown accustomed to the colder weather in the east near the Frostlands. It was strange to be in a place where the sun felt hot on his skin, and now the weather here was turning toward summer. His sledge soon caught up to the Parshman crew. The two sledges walked side by side for a time, and Moash liked to think that keeping pace with his crew could motivate the poor Parshmen. Then one of them slipped and fell, and the entire team lurched to a stop. The whipping began. The cries, the crack of leather on skin. "That's enough." Moash dropped his rope and stepped up the line. His shocked overseers called after him, but didn't follow. Perhaps they were too surprised. He strode up to the Parshman sledge, where the slaves were struggling to pull themselves back up and start again. Several had bloody faces and backs. The large Parshman who had slipped lay curled on the ground. His feet were bleeding. No wonder he'd had trouble walking. Two overseers were whipping him. Moash seized one by the shoulder and pushed him back. "Stop it," he snapped, then shoved the other overseer aside. "Don't you see what you're doing? You're becoming like us." The two overseers stared at him, dumbfounded. "You can't abuse each other," Moash said. "You can't." He turned toward the fallen Parshman and extended a hand to help him up. But from the corner of his eye, he saw one of the overseers raise his arm. Moash spun and caught the whip that cracked at him, snatching it from the air and twisting it around his wrist to gain leverage. Then he yanked it, pulling the overseer stumbling toward him. Moash smashed a fist into his face, slamming him backward to the ground. Storms, that hurt. He shook his hand, which had clipped Carapace on the side as he connected. He glared at the other overseer, who yelled gulped and dropped his whip, jumping backward. Moash nodded once, then took the fallen slave by the arm and pulled him upright. Ride in the sledge. Feel those feet. He took the parchment slave's place in line and pulled the rope taut over his shoulder. By now, his own overseers had gathered their wits and chased after him. They conferred with the two that he'd confronted, one nursing a bleeding cut around his eye. Their conversation was hushed, urgent, and punctuated by intimidated glances toward him. Finally, they decided to let it be. Moash pulled the sledge with the parchment, and they found someone to replace him on the other sledge. For a while, he thought more would come of it. He even saw one of the overseers conferring with a fused, but they didn't punish him. No one dared to again raise a whip against the Parchman crew the rest of the march. 49. Born unto light. 23 years ago. Dalinar pressed his fingers together, then rubbed them, scraping the dry red-brown moss against itself. The scratchy sound was unpleasantly similar to that of a knife along bone. He felt the warmth immediately, like an ember. A thin plume of smoke rose from his calloused fingers and struck below his nose, then parted around his face. Everything faded. The raucous sound of too many men in one room, the musky smell of their bodies pressed together. Spread through him like salts. He released a protracted sigh. He didn't even mind when Bashan accidentally elbowed him. Most places, being high prince would have won him a bubble of space, but at the stained wooden table in this poorly lit den, social standing was irrelevant. Here, with a good drink and a little help pressed between his fingers, he could finally relax. Here, nobody cared how presentable he was or if he drank too much. Here, he didn't have to listen to reports of rebellion and imagine himself out on those fields solving problems the direct way, sword in hand, thrill in his heart. He rubbed the moss more vigorously. Don't think about war, just live in the moment, as Evie always said. Avar returned with drinks. The lean, bearded man studied the overcrowded bench, then set the drinks down and hauled a slumped drunk out of his spot. He squeezed in beside Bashan. Avar was light-eyed, good family, too. He'd been one of Dalinar's elites back when that had meant something, though now he had his own land and a high commission. He was one of the few who didn't salute Dalinar so hard you could hear it. Bashan, though, well, Bashan was an odd one. Dark-eyed at the first nod, the portly man had traveled half the world and encouraged Dalinar to go with him to see the other half. He still wore that stupid white-brimmed fluffy hat. Avar grunted, passing down the drinks. Squeezing in beside you, Bashan, would be far easier if you didn't have a gut that stretched to next week. Just trying to do my duty, Bright Lord. Your duty? Light-eyes need folks to obey them, right? I'm making certain that you got lots to serve you. At least by weight. Dalinar took his mug, but didn't drink. For now, the fire moss was doing its job. His wasn't the only plume rising in the dim stone chamber. Gavilar hated the stuff, but then Gavilar liked his life now. In the center of the dim room, a pair of parshmen pushed tables aside, then started setting diamond chips on the floor. Men backed away, making space for a large ring of light. A couple of shirtless men pushed their way through the crowd. The room's general air of clumsy conversation turned to one of roaring excitement. Are we going to bet? Avar asked. Sure, Bashan replied. I'll put these 3 garnet marks on the shorter one. I'll take that bet, Avar said, but not for the money. If I win, I want your hat. Deal. Ha! So you're finally going to admit how dashing it is? Dashing? Storms, Bashan. I'm going to do you a favor and burn the thing. Dalinar sat back, mind dulled by the fire moss. Burn my hat, Bashan said. Storms, Avar. That's harsh. Just because you envy my dashing profile. The only thing dashing about that hat is how it makes women run the other way. It's exotic. From the West. Everyone knows fashion comes from the West. Yeah, from Leofor and Yezier. Where did you get that hat again? The Pure Lake. Ah, that bastion of culture and fashion. Are you going shopping in Badland next? Barmaids don't know the difference, Bastion grumbled. Anyway, can we just watch the match? I'm looking forward to winning those marks off you. He took a drink, but fingered his hat anxiously. Dalinar closed his eyes. He felt as if he could drift off, maybe get some sleep without worrying about Debbie or dreaming of war. In the ring, bodies smacked against each other. That sound, the grunts of exertion as the wrestlers tried to push each other from the ring, reminded him of the battle. Dalinar opened his eyes, dropped the moss, and leaned forward. The shorter wrestler danced out of the other's grip. They revolved around one another, crouched, hands at the ready. When they locked again, the shorter man pushed his opponent off balance. Better stance, Dalinar thought. Kept himself low. That taller fellow has gotten by too long on his strength and size. He's got terrible form. The two strained, backing toward the edge of the ring before the taller man managed to trip them both. Dalinar stood up as others ahead of him raised their hands and cheered. The contest, the fight. That led me to almost kill Gavilar. Dalinar sat back down. The shorter man won. Avar sighed, but rolled a few glowing spears to Bastion. Double or nothing on the next bout? Nah, Bastion said, hefting the marks. It should be enough. For what? To bribe a few influential young dandies into trying hats like mine, Bastion said. I tell you, once word gets out, everyone is going to be wearing them. You're an idiot. So long as I'm a fashionable one. Dalinar reached to the floor and picked up the fire moss. He tossed it onto the table and stared at it, then took a pull from his mug of wine. The next wrestling match started, and he winced as the two competitors collided. Storms. Why did he keep putting himself into situations like this? Dalinar, Avar said. Any word yet on when we're going to the Rift? The Rift? Bastion asked. What about it? Are you dense? Avar said. No, Bastion said. But I might be drunk. What's up with the Rift? Rumor is they want to set up their own high prince, Avar said. Son of the old one. What was his name? Tamerlane, Dalinar said. But we're not going to be visiting the Rift, Avar. Surely the king can't. We won't be going, Dalinar said. You've got men to train, and Dalinar drank more wine. I'm going to be a father. My brother can handle the Rift with diplomacy. Avar leaned back, flippantly dropping his mug to the table. The king can't politic his way past open rebellion, Dalinar. Dalinar closed his fist around the fire moss, but didn't rub it in. How much of his interest in the Rift was his duty to protect Gavilar's kingdom, and how much was his craving to feel the thrill again? Damnation. He felt like half a man these days. One of the wrestlers had shoved the other from the ring, disturbing the line of lights. The loser was declared, and the Parshman carefully reset the ring. As he did so, a master servant stepped up to Dalinar's table. Pardon, Bright Lord, he whispered, but you should know. The feature match will have to be cancelled. What? Bastion said. What's wrong? Mark isn't going to fight? Pardon, the master servant repeated, but his opponent has stomach problems. The match must be cancelled. Apparently, news was spreading through the room. The crowd manifested their disapproval with boos and curses, shouts, and spilled drinks. A tall, bald man stood at the side of the ring, bare-chested. He argued with several of the light-eyed organizers, pointing at the ring, anger spread, pulling on the floor around him. To Dalinar, this racket sounded like the calls of battle. He closed equal sorrows, Dalinar said, stepping up onto the table. Seems like we've got a room full of sorrow here. Avar gaped, jaw dropping. Bet on me, Dalinar said, for old time's sake. He leaped off the table on the other side, then shoved through the crowd. Someone tell that man he has a challenger. Silence spread from him like a bad smell. Dalinar found himself at the edge of the ring in a completely quiet room, packed with once rowdy men, both wide-eyed and dark. The wrestler, Mok, stepped back, his dark green eyes wide, anger spread vanishing. He had a powerful build, arms that bulged like they were overstuffed. Word was he'd never been defeated. Well, Dalinar said, you wanted a fight, and I need a workout. Right, Gordon, the man said. This was to be a free-form bout. All hits and holds allowed. Excellent, Dalinar said. What? You worried about injuring your high prince? I promise you clemency for anything done to me. Hurting you? The man said. Storms, that's not what I'm afraid of. He shivered visibly, and a Balin woman, perhaps his manager, smacked him on the arm. She thought he'd been rude. Lord bowed and backed away. Dalinar turned about the room, confronted by a sea of faces that suddenly seemed very uncomfortable. He'd broken some kind of rule here. The gathering dissolved, armies retrieving spears from the ground. It seemed Dalinar had been too hasty to judge rank unimportant here. They'd suffered him as an observer, but he was not to participate. Damnation. He growled softly as he stalked to his bench, those hangers spread following him on the floor. He took his shirt from fashion with a swipe of the hand. Back with his elites, any man, from the lowest spearman to the highest captains, would have sparred or wrestled with him. Storms he'd faced the cook several times, much to the amusement of everyone involved. He sat down and pulled on his shirt, moving it so quickly. The room fell silent as people continued to leave, and Dalinar just sat there, tense, his body still expecting the fight that would never come. No thrill.
Okay, that's all for today.
Soon he and his friends were alone in the room, surveying empty tables, abandoned cups, and spilled drinks. The place somehow smelled even worse now than it had when crowded with men. Probably for the best, right, Lord? Avar said. I want to be among soldiers again, Avar, Dalinar whispered. I want to be marching again. Best sleep a man can get is after a long march. Damnation, I want to fight. I want to face someone who won't pull their punches because I'm a high prince. Then let's find such a fight, Dalinar, Avar said. Surely the king will let us go. If not to the Rift, then to Herdaz or one of the Isles. We can bring him land